Story 1. I always considered myself a rational person, a student, a future doctor, who does not give in to emotions and believes only in facts. I did not believe in the supernatural and always brushed off strange stories that others told. But everything changed one evening when I came across something that completely turned my perception of reality upside down. My name is Alex, and at that moment I was living an ordinary life. Everything was going according to plan, studying, working at the clinic, some free time for myself. My friend Jack, with whom I had been friends for a long time, was into all sorts of strange things. He was a techie, and his world revolved around computers, programming, and everything connected with it. I did not share his hobbies, but I never interfered with him. That evening, Jack invited me to his place. His apartment, as usual, was cluttered with all sorts of technology, monitors, wires, keyboards, and mice that reminded me of his endless experiments with codes. But this was not just his job, it was his way of life, which I did not always understand. I watched with interest as he went to strange forums and some closed chats where mysterious topics were discussed. But today was different. Jack was quietly scrolling through the pages on his screen when he suddenly turned to me and said that he had found something interesting. I wasn't in the mood to follow his search, but out of habit I glanced at the screen. The forum he had stumbled upon was strange. It looked like an ordinary page for exchanging experiences among people who were fascinated by abandoned buildings and adventures. However, when I looked closer, I noticed that this was no ordinary site. Part of it was hidden, and I felt that something was wrong. He showed me an email that had arrived in his inbox. It was from an unknown recipient and contained only one line of text: coordinates. For a moment I thought it might be a mistake, but when I looked closer, something felt odd. I'd never believed in mysticism, but this set of numbers and letters seemed important. I opened the Dropbox link Jack had sent and downloaded the file. It was an image. It showed a place surrounded by cliffs, with heat spots against the rocks. The red dots in the image represented something that was hard to explain. The dots didn't look random. There were 6 of them, and they were arranged in somewhat odd groups. My mind was trying to find an explanation for all this. Maybe it was just a joke? But something about it was bothering me. I couldn't understand why Jack was so interested in this. He was always calm and reasonable, but today his eyes were shining with unusual interest. The letter was not just spam, and its content seemed too real to be fiction. Jack continued his search and soon came across photos taken in the same place. They showed people in tactical gear, standing at some old door that was clearly destroyed and abandoned. Their faces were not visible, and all that remained was a mystery that we could not solve. But why were these photos sent to such a network, and the account itself disappeared a few minutes later? We weren't supposed to do this, but something inside us told us we couldn't back out. Maybe it was just a game, or maybe we'd found something more. Jack was sure it wasn't just a coincidence, and his confidence infected me. We began searching for more information, diving deeper into the dark corners of the internet. But the more we dug, the clearer it became that this place really did exist. However, it was hidden from the eyes of most. I lay awake for a long time that night, thinking about what we'd found. It all seemed strange, almost unreal, but I couldn't stop thinking about those coordinates. Someone wanted us to find this place. It was too organized to be an accident. We decided to go. I didn't know what was in store for us, but I couldn't refuse. It was like an invitation to the unknown, and maybe that was the whole point of this story, to look beyond the familiar world and encounter something new. The next morning, after much thought and several hours of sleepless conversations with Jack, I decided that I would go after all. We both knew it could be a mistake, but we couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than just a coincidence. There were too many coincidences, too many unanswered questions. In the morning, I quickly packed a backpack with food, water, and the necessary equipment, flashlights, cameras, and everything else that might be useful on the hike. Jack was more prepared as usual. His backpack was full of gadgets, some other devices that he promised to use to study anomalies if we encountered them. The trip began with a mundane routine. Boring roads, rare cars, and familiar landscapes, but the further we drove, the more restless the air became. I had a strange feeling, as if I was not just driving along the road, but crossing some invisible boundary. The time we spent on the road began to blur, and I began to think that perhaps This was all just a trick of the mind. We were driving Jack's old SUV, which wasn't really suited for this kind of trip, but at some point I realized that it didn't matter. We were heading into the unknown, and the more I thought about it, the more determined my inner voice became that we had to do this. When we reached the side of the road, the place didn't seem so strange. Usually, such parts of the forest don't attract attention, but here something was wrong. The trees growing along the road seemed old and forgotten, and their branches hung too close to the ground. I couldn't shake the feeling that no one had been here for a long time, as if time itself did not dare to pass through this place. We decided to leave the car in a small area and continue on foot. Jack, as always, was full of enthusiasm, and I felt some kind of wariness in myself, which grew with each step. After a while, the forest became denser, and the ground under our feet became sticky, as if we really were entering some abandoned space where no human foot had stepped for a long time. With each step, I was less and less sure that we were making the right choice. It was quiet, too quiet. Only the occasional sound of the wind and the rustling of leaves underfoot could be heard. We stopped to check the map, and then I noticed that Jack was no longer looking at it, but was watching something in the forest. I turned my head and saw it too. On the horizon, right in front of us, almost imperceptibly, stood a strange rock, jagged and covered in moss. This was the place we were looking for. The coordinates led us here. We started moving towards it, trying not to lose sight of the strange object. With every step, the forest became more and more deaf and dark, as if absorbing us. At some point, I felt something cold pierce me, a feeling that we were not alone. I looked at Jack, but he seemed to be absorbed in something of his own. When we got closer, we discovered that the rock was not just a stone. It was a door. It was covered in a layer of moss and looked like it had been there for centuries. I took a few steps towards it, and then Jack, bending down, noticed something strange on its surface. The edges of the door were covered with engraved signs that I could not understand. They were old, perhaps ancient, but there was something familiar about them, as if I had already seen something similar in some books. Jack tried to touch the door, but as soon as his fingers touched the surface, something strange happened. The door began to shake slightly, and it seemed to me that the air around it became even denser. I felt the blood leave my face. This was not just a place, it was something deeper, older than I could imagine. I looked at Jack, but his face remained inscrutable. His eyes were burning, and he continued to try to open the door as if this was his only goal. I don't know what exactly made me take the next step. Perhaps it was curiosity, perhaps some strange force, but I took a step towards the door, and when I touched its surface, it suddenly opened. The sound of the old door creaking in the stillness of the night was so loud that it seemed as if the very earth shook. It was dark inside, but I felt a strange glow begin to shine behind me. We were standing on the threshold of the unknown, and nothing could have prepared us for what was behind that door. When the door opened, a thick, dark corridor appeared before us, in which dim lights flickered faintly, like distant stars. The air smelled of old age, dampness, and something metallic, reminiscent of long-forgotten dungeons. It seemed to me that there was no time or space inside this place. Everything was familiar and alien at the same time. Jack, despite his confidence, seemed a little nervous, but he continued to walk forward, as if something was drawing him into this labyrinth. I followed him, my mind spinning with thoughts that none of this could be a coincidence. The labyrinth we had entered seemed too planned and too perfect to be an abandoned structure. It seemed like this place had been built for a purpose. The corridor we found ourselves in narrowed and widened, as if it had no clear boundaries. The walls, covered in strange drawings and symbols, resembled something similar to ruins, but this was not quite true. These signs were alive, as if they were changing before our eyes, revealing new forms that disappeared as soon as we looked at them. The dim light coming from the corners was constantly eclipsed, as if someone or something was trying to keep us from moving forward. I felt that strange feeling again, as if we should not be here, as if someone was watching us from the darkness. And there was something frightening in this feeling, but at the same time, alluring. We moved deeper and deeper into this underground labyrinth, and each new turn revealed more and more strange objects and signs before us. Jack continued to walk confidently, almost not noticing the changes around him, as if he was ready to see something incredible. But with each step I lost my determination. We were too far from home, too far from everything familiar. At some point the corridor began to narrow sharply, and we had to squeeze through tight passages where the walls seemed to literally press in on us. The air became more and more humid, and the sound of our steps echoed in the emptiness. And suddenly we found ourselves in a room that was impossible to describe in words. It was a huge cave, in the center of which stood a huge metal structure, similar to an ancient arch. Around it were scattered numerous objects, similar to the wreckage of some machines, parts of structures, and strange artifacts. Many chains and heavy mechanisms wrapped around it, creating a feeling that the arch held something important, something that we had not yet realized. Jack came closer to the arch, carefully examining it. I remained at a distance, feeling how my body was tense with tension. There was something unnatural here, something that violated the laws of nature. "It looks like a portal," Jack said, and his voice did not seem to echo in the emptiness of this cave. He was absorbed in his research, as always, but I could not shake the feeling that all of this was too dangerous. Something about this place clearly did not fit reality. What I knew. I tried to look inside the arch, but the closer I got, the more I felt time darken and slow down around me. It was as if I was becoming part of something much bigger, much older, and more dangerous than I could have imagined. My thoughts began to blur, and images appeared in my head that I could not understand. Everything around me seemed too alive. I stepped back abruptly, but at that moment something pulled me. Forces that I could not control forced my steps towards the arch. Jack did not notice this. He was busy with his calculations. I tried to resist this unknown attraction, but it seemed to me that my legs did not obey me. Suddenly I heard a sound that was unlike anything I had ever heard. It was like heavy breathing coming from the very heart of the cave. I froze, and then again I felt something begin to move in the darkness. I looked around, but at that moment something suddenly grabbed my hand. My body was not ready for this. All my strength left me, and I felt something huge, dark, and alive begin to move in the depths of the cave. I tried to break free, but as soon as I did, a loud bang was heard in the air, and the light coming from the arch became even brighter, flaring up to a white light. I closed my eyes and felt something indescribable penetrate me, something that made me forget about everything. In the darkness behind the door there was silence, absolute and unbearable. I stood on the threshold, trying to adjust to the darkness in front of me. It seemed like nothing had changed, but there seemed to be something in the air, a ghostly feeling that we had violated something important. And yet, I stepped inside. My eyes gradually adjusted to the darkness. What I saw was not fantastic, but it was definitely strange. We found ourselves in a huge cave, the walls of which were covered with strange patterns. They resembled the images I had seen on ancient maps and in books related to myths and legends, but no one could explain where such signs could have come from. Jack seemed not to notice these details. His face was illuminated by the light of a small lamp, and he moved forward with interest, exploring the cave, as if this moment was the only thing that mattered. I tried to catch his gaze, but there was something incomprehensible in his eyes. It felt like he was in some kind of trance, as if he was captured by something more than just curiosity. As I was trying to gather my thoughts, something made me look back, a slight rustling. It was unnatural. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise. Something was watching us. I looked back at Jack, who was walking deeper into the cave, but as soon as his footsteps stopped, I heard it, a slight bark. It had all started with that, a bark like a dog, but it was different. Something about the sound was alien, unnatural, like it couldn't come from a normal animal. My mind was already trying to grasp the picture, but I could not find an answer. I froze. The bark came again, closer this time, and there was alarm in it. Dogs usually bark for a reason, to warn their owners about something, but this was different. It was a warning sound, but what did it want to warn? I felt the cold silence tighten again, and then, when I tried to move, something suddenly rushed past, a flashing shadow. I did not even have time to turn, and at that moment I felt my heart sink into my heels, a clicking sound like teeth clicking quickly in the darkness. I looked around, but there was nothing, only this shadow, disappearing in the blink of an eye. I took my flashlight and went up to Jack. He still did not notice the oddities. His face glowed with curiosity, and his gaze wandered over the patterns on the walls. But I was no longer up to it. "Jack!" I called sharply. He turned around, his eyes blank, as if he hadn't heard me. And then, as if on cue, his face grew more serious. He felt something, saw something, which I was beginning to understand. Suddenly a sharp sound. A dog, or what should have been a dog but wasn't. Barking, but not just barking, but sounds that couldn't possibly come from an animal. It was more like an attempt to imitate human speech with a broken timbre, as if the animal was trying to imitate a human but couldn't. The shadow flickered in the distance again. I felt the tension in the air become palpable. I couldn't just stand there and wait for us to face this. 1,000 thoughts swirled through my head, but the only thing I knew was that I had to keep going. We couldn't go back. And then I heard something that made me stop. The barking came again. It wasn't from the world I lived in, or the one I knew. It was a call from the depths of the forest, from inside the cave itself, from a place I couldn't understand. I took a step forward despite my uncertainty. Jack followed me, though his gaze was still focused on the surrounding area. He said nothing, but I saw in his eyes the same anxiety I felt. As we approached the shadow, which was no longer just a flickering silhouette but was clearly moving in our path, I again felt that strange, bone-chilling sensation. We were so close that we could make out the shape of the thing. It was not a dog. It was some kind of humanoid shape with fur and claws, but with a face that defied all reasonable explanation. Its eyes were empty, and in their depths there was something terrible that defied logic. We stood before this thing, and I knew that it was not simply watching us. It was waiting. Instinctively, I took Jack's hand, and in that moment we both felt the world around us begin to change. As the shadow that had once seemed like a vague silhouette began to move toward us, a wave of anxiety washed over me. I could have screamed, run, or tried to defend myself in some way, but instinct told me that no amount of effort would help. Fear gripped my muscles. Jack froze, his body tense as a taut string ready to snap. The creature standing before us radiated such an aura of terror that words lost their meaning. It was neither human nor animal, nor any creature that could be accurately described. It was not just a shadow, but something alive, mimicking everything we know, but in a distorted, sinister form. I could have sworn that its eyes, eerily empty and dark, were looking right through me. I took a step back, but my legs wouldn't move. Jack noticed this and started to retreat as well. And that's when the creature moved. It didn't jump on us or try to attack, but the way it moved made it feel like it was controlling the space, forcing us to move in a certain direction. Every step I took back made me feel a growing pressure, as if I was moving into some kind of trap. The feeling of being surrounded by something invisible was unbearable. There was no sound, no wind, only this shadow that seemed to pull the light around, absorbing it, creating an unimaginable darkness. I tried to find some way out, to figure out what to do, but all I could do was watch as the creature approached, and then disappeared in an instant, dissolving into thin air as if it had never been there. Jack continued to stare into the darkness. His face was pale, and his eyes were filled with the same worry I hadn't seen in a long time. He slowly turned to me. "This isn't possible," he said, as if trying to comprehend what was happening. "This can't be real." I didn't know what to say. The fear I felt was too strong. It seemed to me that this creature was either watching us or waiting for us to do something ourselves. Suddenly, I felt cold. This cold was not just physical. It penetrated inside, into the very soul. The feeling was familiar, as if I was encountering something that was beyond my understanding. I was no longer sure if what we were seeing was real or just a product of some nightmare. Maybe it was a reflection of our fears or something that really existed in the dark corners of the world. "We have to go," I said, gathering my strength with difficulty. I did not know what this creature wanted from us, but the feeling of unease was growing stronger. We had to find a way out before it appeared again. We began to move, but there was no safe path. I felt like we were not just wandering, but walking in a circle. The whole cave seemed so familiar and alien at the same time. When I looked around, I realized that the walls were starting to change, as if the space around us was rebuilding itself. Every step I took became heavier. It wasn't just physical exhaustion, but something much deeper. I felt the emptiness begin to squeeze me, a shadow enveloping my consciousness. And then I heard that bark again. It was so close that it seemed as if we were in the center of this horror. I froze, holding my breath. The bark sounded No, not like a dog. It was something else, something that might not be an animal at all. The bark was dry, hoarse, with some kind of metallic note, as if an animal were trying to speak. Jack heard it at the same time as me, and we both stopped. I wanted to say something, but I couldn't find the right words. Suddenly, a figure appeared in front of us. The creature did not come right up to me, but it was close, so close that I could feel its presence in every cell of my body. I tried to take a step back, but my legs did not move. I realized that this was no longer just a creature, but something that captured consciousness and thoughts. I turned to Jack. His eyes were wide, and the expression on his face said he too could feel the space around us changing. We couldn't be sure if this wasn't just our imagination, but I knew this was nothing we could handle. The question wasn't how to defeat this thing, but whether we could get out of here alive. "Jack, can you feel it?" I finally exhaled. He nodded silently. There was something different in his gaze, not just fear, but the realization that we were up against something we couldn't fight. I glanced back toward the exit, but it seemed more and more out of reach, as if it were moving away with every step we took. The shadow was moving again. Story 2. I always thought that my job was just to take pictures. It seems like nothing complicated, just to capture a space, make it attractive to a buyer. But in practice, everything is much more complicated. After all, I am the person who must convince people to love what many consider hopeless. I am not talking about modern housing with large windows and a view of the park, but about worn-out, abandoned houses. When no one has looked after them for a long time, they begin to hide their secrets. And I must, in a sense, help reveal these secrets, or at least convince people that there is potential hidden behind the external squalor. I'm not usually scared. I'm used to old buildings, their smells and worn wallpaper. But this house was different. It was a Victorian mansion on the outskirts of town. I'd heard about it before. It had been on the market for a few years and no one seemed to be able to sell it. Either the location wasn't right or the building itself was too run down for buyers to be interested. But the real estate agent I spoke to kept assuring me that the house was perfect for the right buyer. Well, for me, it was just another job. When I got there, the first thing I noticed was the loneliness of the place. The house stood far from the other buildings, surrounded by tall trees that seemed to be constantly reaching out to its windows, as if trying to climb in. The very battered gate creaked when I opened it, and the door itself reluctantly yielded to my efforts, as if trying to keep me out. At first, I laughed at this, thinking that these were just old doors. When I walked in, I was immediately hit with the smell of dust and dampness. It was dark inside, even though the sun was shining brightly. The light that came through the windows seemed dim and weak, as if the house itself was absorbing all the light. I took off my backpack and took out my camera, trying to relax. It was just a house, and I was here to do my job. The living room was the first room I started shooting in. The dim light cast long shadows that stretched unnaturally along the floor, giving the room an eerie look. The furniture was old and worn, and the carpet that covered the floor looked like it hadn't been cleaned in decades. I took a few shots, looking at the details, and checked the images on the camera, but something was wrong. In the mirror hanging on one of the walls, I saw someone. The figure was dim, barely visible in the dusty reflection, but it was there. A man. He stood in the corner of the room, a dark figure dressed in old clothes. I turned around immediately, my heart skipping a beat, but the rooms were empty. I felt a chill run down my spine. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, I thought, or the shadows playing with perception, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I looked at the camera screen again. The figure was still there, in the corner, clearer than before. I grabbed the camera and took a few more pictures, feeling the air around me grow thick, as if the house was holding its breath. I wanted to leave, but something held me back. I looked away from the camera and into the mirror again. The same man, the same look, although it was still just a reflection. In my head, I kept telling myself that it was just a trick of the light. I took a few more photos and then moved further into the house. The strange feeling didn't leave me, but I ignored it. It wasn't the first time I had to work in such old, forgotten places. I kept moving, trying to focus on the task at hand. But then I heard it. At first, it was the faint creaking of floorboards above, as if someone was walking on the upper floor. I stopped, listening, but the sound was gone. Maybe it was just the old building, I thought. I continued filming, but the footsteps were back. They were clearer, slow, measured steps. I could hear them even as I climbed the stairs, but as soon as I entered the rooms, the silence fell upon me again. I felt like the space around me was shrinking, like I was trapped somewhere with no way out. The camera kept shooting, and every time I looked at the pictures, I felt less and less comfortable. The furniture was changing. The chairs were turned the other way. The rugs were moved. In one of the rooms, off camera, I saw a figure. A man standing in the shadows. This picture really scared me. I stood there staring at the screen, trying to figure out what was happening. There couldn't be more people in the room. I was alone. I turned around again, but the room was empty. There weren't enough words to describe what I was feeling. To think that this was all a trick of the light, or shadow, or exhaustion, seemed increasingly absurd. I finished filming, packed my things, and hurried out. Strange thoughts were spinning in my head. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe there was something wrong with the camera. But something inside me told me that I had experienced something more than just bad lighting. Back in the car, I breathed a sigh of relief. But it was at that moment that I felt something watching me. The next day, despite the night's worries, I returned to the office and sent the photos. The real estate agent was pleased, saying that the photos perfectly highlighted the potential of the house. I myself was not sure that this was exactly what was needed, but, as always, I did my job. It seemed like it should have been left behind, but something about that house was bothering me. After I finished work and returned home, I tried several times to forget about what happened in the house, but the feelings it evoked would not leave me. When I went to bed, I did not fall asleep right away. Images, sounds, shadows kept spinning in my head, and I could not force myself to forget that strange moment when I saw the figure in the mirror. I replayed it over and over again. She was standing there, in the corner, dim, barely distinguishable, but she was there. The creaking of floorboards upstairs, footsteps, shadows that seemed to haunt my consciousness, and the strangest thing was the photographs I had taken. I played them back on the screen over and over again. In some frames, the figure in the mirror was barely visible, but in others, it was clear, distinct, almost real. I tried restarting the camera again, but no matter how I looked at the pictures, the figure was there. I couldn't seem to explain it away as just the old house, just the light, the play of shadows. I closed my eyes, trying to calm down, but those steps wouldn't let me rest. And now again, just like that evening, I seemed to hear the creaking of floorboards. But I was at home, in my apartment, in my quiet, familiar place. What could be strange about an old building? Why couldn't I get that house out of my head? And now, before falling asleep, I felt hot again. In the house, shadows were moving there, in the dark corners of the room. I tried to ignore them. I woke up in the night. The clock showed 3 o'clock. I couldn't understand why I had been woken up, but when I listened, I heard the steps again. Slow, measured, as if someone was leisurely walking around the house. They were so clear, so distinct, as if this person was right next to me. My heart started pounding and I froze, pressing myself to the pillow. Steps. They didn't stop. I quickly got out of bed, hoping that it was just the house settling. The old beams, maybe the floor creaking. But when I looked out into the hallway, everything was too quiet, too empty. I closed my bedroom door again, forcing myself to calm down. Maybe it was just my imagination, no big deal. But still, this house, these footsteps, this man in the mirror, something was wrong. I sat in silence, listening to my breathing slowly calm down. I just needed to sleep, just get through this moment. But the footsteps didn't stop. They continued, despite my best efforts to ignore them. I stood up again, this time with the intention of checking out what was going on. Slowly, as if something was telling me I shouldn't, I walked to the door, opened it, and looked out into the hallway. In the shadows under the lamplight, I saw him, a man standing at the end of the hallway. He wasn't moving, he was just standing there, looking at me. There was nothing human in his eyes. They were dark, black, as if the darkness itself lived in his gaze, and something in that gaze made my body freeze. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. He was standing there just like in the mirror, but now he was here in reality, so close. His presence was unimaginably heavy. I couldn't take my eyes off him. And then I heard his voice. It was deep, low, as if it was coming from the wall itself. "You took a picture of me." It was as if the shadows behind him were moving. They were stretching and distorting, as if they were trying to grab me. I flinched back, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. His voice cut through the silence again. "You took my picture." Each word cut through the air, becoming more and more hoarse, as if the house itself was speaking to me, as if it were alive and miserable, consuming everything around it. I stood there motionless, and one single thought was spinning in my head. What is this? What is happening? I tried to say something, but the words wouldn't come out. I couldn't even take a step. The man didn't come closer. He just stood there, and his eyes were fixed on me, as if he could see right through me. Time dragged on endlessly, and every moment was torture. He took a step. His movements were slow, smooth, but each step felt like a blow to my nerves. He was not moving towards me, but towards the shadow that appeared behind me, and with each step the shadows grew longer. I felt the air around me thicken, become cold, oppressive. "You are mine now," he said, and his words echoed in the room. I felt the ground shift beneath my feet. The footsteps grew louder, and I suddenly realized I couldn't move. I was trapped, locked in my own home. It was like a nightmare, but I knew I couldn't wake up. I stood there, not knowing how to escape. The man wasn't coming toward me. He just stood there, his eyes continuing to stare into mine, and every moment seemed like an eternity. It was as if the walls of my house were closing in around me, squeezing the air. "You're mine," he repeated. The next day I woke up with a feeling that something had changed. Even the sun that was shining through the curtains couldn't dispel the strange heaviness in the air. It seemed that something in the house had taken on a life of its own. This feeling became even stronger when I went into the bathroom and saw myself in the mirror. Everything was fine, but the feeling of something alien wouldn't leave me. It was as if an invisible whisper had flashed through my head. I couldn't shake the thought that that house had left its mark on my reality. I relived the events of the day I took the photographs. The figure in the mirror, the footsteps that weren't there as I tried to climb the stairs, the rooms that changed with each new frame. It must have been some kind of nervous breakdown or stress from work, I told myself, but something didn't add up. Why did I see the same scenes over and over in my head? Why couldn't I shake these strange memories? Why didn't this house let me go? By evening, I was back home. I think I was trying to forget about everything, but my thoughts wouldn't stop haunting me. The room was getting colder. I settled down on the couch, turned off the light, but I couldn't sleep. The noises from the neighboring apartments, the sounds of the city, it all seemed far away, as if I was on the other side of the world. Everything was quiet in my room, but it was too quiet, a silence that was oppressive to the ear. I felt my breathing become heavier, my heart faster. Not much time passed when suddenly I heard a familiar sound. Footsteps. Very faint, but distinct. They were coming from somewhere in the hallway. I froze, trying to figure out what it was. There was no one else in the apartment except me. I put my feet in slippers and went out into the hallway, paying close attention to every sound. The house was quieter than usual, almost as if the air had stopped moving. I looked around carefully but saw nothing. No sign of anything unusual. Silence. I went back to my room and closed the door, trying not to panic, but my heart kept pounding in my chest and my thoughts kept circling around that house. Something was pulling me back, as if I had to go back, something invisible but very real. And then there were the steps again. They seemed even closer, as if someone was right behind the door. I stood up again and walked towards the door. My legs were wobbly. It didn't make sense. This was my house, where I lived, but I didn't feel at home here. I opened the door and looked out into the hallway. There was no one there. Everything was empty. I walked down the hallway, feeling for the switch to turn on the light. The walls seemed too close, too dark. Although light shades usually filled these rooms, I felt shadows lurking around every corner, growing larger and darker. Suddenly I heard a rustling sound, barely noticeable. It was a sound that I could always write off as a coincidence, like an old house creaking. But now it seemed more to me. I felt something had changed. I turned, trying to find the source of the sound, but there was nothing. The footsteps didn't stop. They moved through the house with relentless speed. I glanced at my phone. It was in my hands, but there was no message, no call. Marcus hadn't texted. I froze again, listening. The footsteps didn't stop. They kept coming. I couldn't remember what had happened on previous nights when I had encountered this sound, but I knew one thing for sure. These footsteps were here now. They weren't disappearing. I wasn't alone in this house, but something much more terrible was approaching me. I thought it might be a dream, but everything around me was too real, too cold. Everything was too believable in this alien reality. Trying not to panic, I returned to my room, making sure the door was tightly closed. I felt my legs buckling, but I couldn't stop. With each new step, I realized that returning to this house was a mistake. The last time I looked at the camera, my eyes were frozen in horror. I saw something in the image. It wasn't just a reflection in a mirror. It was him, the man standing in the corner, like in the pictures I'd taken before. He was standing in the room. He was in the house, not as a reflection, but as a reality. A living, unimaginably real presence. I tried to forget about it, told myself that it would all go away on its own, but every moment, every glance into the shadows, every step out of the hallway made me believe more and more that I couldn't get out. This house wouldn't let me go, and now, even here in my apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was there, that it was following me. All of this was connected to that house, and with every moment I became more and more sure of one thing: I couldn't hide from it. A few days had passed since I left that house. I tried to live a normal life, focusing on work again, but the peace in my life was just an illusion. Everything seemed normal until I encountered that feeling again, the feeling that someone was watching me. That evening I came home already expecting something to be wrong, and it happened again. The same cold, the same tense silence, the same invisible gaze watching my every move. I tried to convince myself that it was all a figment of my imagination. It was dark outside, and the lamplight cast unsettling, elongated shadows, as if the world itself was trying to hide its dark secrets from me. I felt that inner chill again, familiar and inexplicable, creeping through my body as I walked through the apartment. Every room seemed empty and distant, and around every corner I thought I could see him, the man from the house. The shadow that was watching me. I didn't know what to do. The feeling of this presence was so strong that I felt my body literally freezing in fear. All these steps, rustling, creaking in the silence of the night, all this became so real that I could hardly cope with it. For a moment, I wondered if I had become a prisoner of this damned house from which I could never escape. It was still with me, and something in me was pulling me back, to its dark corners, to its cold walls, where I once felt that I might not return. But not today. Today I tried to rationalize, tried to convince myself that I needed to move on, to take steps toward a normal life. I stood in my apartment, trying to collect my thoughts, but the air was too heavy. There was no noise in the room, just emptiness. But that emptiness felt dangerous. My eyes couldn't stop themselves from exploring the corners, the doorways, because I knew that if I wasn't careful again, if I gave in to this feeling again, I would end up back there, in that house, with him. Suddenly I heard familiar footsteps. It was so clear and distinct that I froze, listening. It couldn't be. I was in my apartment, and the footsteps were coming from the hallway. I quickly walked to the door and looked out cautiously, but I didn't see anyone. Just silence. I was about to go back into the room when suddenly something moved again, something very weak but distinct, from around the corner. My heart skipped a beat and I froze. For a moment I felt like I was back in that house, and the shadows were reaching out to me again, as if this world was just a stopover between the doors I was trying to leave. I yanked the door handle, forcing myself out into the hallway, and turned toward the kitchen again, but there was no answer. Silence swallowed the space again, leaving me alone. With this feeling, I returned to my room, and within seconds I noticed something strange. At first it was a small, almost imperceptible detail, some distortion on the mirror, where the reflection looked a little cloudy. I decided to ignore it, but when I looked more closely, it was no longer just a distortion. It was an image of this man, the man who had once been in that house. His face was pale and flat, his eyes empty holes. He was standing in the corner, but this time his face was not distorted by the reflection. He was right there. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. My body felt like it had become alien, and my mind was in panic. Why did I come back here? Why didn't I leave as soon as I smelled that terror in the air? My fingers slid across the screen of my phone, trying to find Marcus's number, but at that moment the screen went dark, as if someone had turned it off. I slapped the screen, and it came back on. The screen was blank again. No messages, no calls. Then I heard his voice. It wasn't loud, but the feeling of his presence filled the room. It wasn't just a hiss, but something far more dangerous, some kind of ominous premonition. He was close. I knew it. His figure was becoming more and more obvious, and I realized it was too late to run. The light went out once more, and despite its slight flicker, I felt his eyes fixate on me once more. Oh, how I wished I could leave here, get out of this nightmare, but his presence was like chains wrapped around my soul. It seemed he was waiting for me. I stood frozen in place, unable to move. My hands were shaking, but I couldn't even take a step. My entire world had narrowed to this dark hallway where the shadow stood. It was as if this house was sucking me back into itself, and even though I tried to leave it, it kept pulling me back. I was no longer just a part of this house. I was a part of its curse. When I looked at his face again, it became clear to me that I couldn't leave now. The house wouldn't let me go. I couldn't believe what was happening. I was in my apartment, the very place where I had just tried to find peace. But the world around me had become twisted, distorted, as if I had entered another dimension where everything I knew had ceased to exist. The shadows in the room were now alive, and every movement was filled with sinister, inhuman intent. I ran to the door, trying to get out, but as soon as I pulled the handle, it didn't budge. It was locked. I pulled harder, but the door remained motionless. My nerves were on edge, and the air around me was growing colder and denser, as if the very walls of this apartment were closing in, blocking all escape routes. I glanced at the window, hoping to see the light of the street lamps, but even they seemed dim, as if the world outside was just a backdrop I could no longer enter. My thoughts were in disarray. Everything I had once known now seemed an illusion. I had become a prisoner of this place. And I realized, no matter where I was, be it a house on the outskirts of the city or my own apartment, this nightmare was haunting me. That person, that man, who at first was only a reflection in the mirror, was now here, in this place. His presence hung in the air like a cold breath. He was part of this horror, and I could not get rid of him. I stepped back, looking at the doors and windows that were blocking my exit. Moving forward was impossible, but then I felt him. He was so close I couldn't believe my eyes, but this time his figure was standing right in front of me. I felt the air grow even heavier. His eyes, black and empty, looked straight at me, and I froze in horror again. He wasn't just a part of this room, he was it. He was a part of something I couldn't understand. I tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come out. My voice couldn't break through the icy fear that gripped me. I didn't know what to do. I tried to open the door again, but it was sealed. I think that was the moment I realized. This house, this shadow, this man, they wouldn't leave me. My life, my existence had become part of their world, their space, and now I couldn't get out. The shadows in the room began to move, sliding along the walls. They began to gather in one point, like stars lining up in some ominous picture. I saw how they slowly filled the space around me, pulling in all the light areas, making the darkness even thicker and more enveloping. It seemed to me that the walls were simply shrinking, and I could not breathe. The moment I tried to open the door again, I felt his touch. It was icy, as if the cold itself was penetrating me. I felt his fingers, bony and cold, reaching for me, as if they were sucking the warmth from my body. I tried to push away, but my legs wouldn't move, and my strength was leaving me. I was trapped, and I couldn't get away. I saw his face, that shapeless, blurry face coming toward me. I felt his gaze piercing my soul, stripping me of all will. All I wanted was to leave, to escape, but he wasn't just in this room. He was in my mind. He was in every step, every look, every shadow, and I knew that despite my efforts he had already taken me. I was his, and there was no turning back. At that moment, the world around me seemed to slow down. I no longer felt like a living person, but like a part of something else. My thoughts became blurry and disorganized, as if I were trapped in some kind of nightmare from which there was no awakening. That was the moment when I realized that my attempts to escape were just another illusion. The house, this man, these shadows, they were not just part of this place, they were part of me. I didn't know how long it had been like that, maybe minutes, maybe hours. Time no longer mattered. I was lost in this world, in this space that had no beginning and no end. And then I felt him whisper to me, his voice a hiss, as if it were part of the air itself. His words became ominous, penetrating my mind, my soul. Did you think you could leave? I froze, and all I could do was watch. I was just an object in his world, and I could no longer act. I felt his shadow wrapping around me like a trap, and there was no escape. My life was his game, his toy, and I could no longer resist. I tried to break free again, but it was all in vain. His cold touch became more obvious, and I felt it swallowing me whole. Everything disappeared, and I could no longer distinguish where this world ended and where the other began. Then I understood I would stay here forever, in this place. Trapped. Story 3. The culvert legend has haunted me since I was a child. It was the most talked about topic in the small town where I grew up. In the 1980s, a woman disappeared, and no one knew exactly what happened to her. One version was that her husband had found her with a creature, not a person, but something that could barely be called alive. Some claimed that it had killed her, cut her up and flushed her down the toilet, slowly eating away at her body until she was gone entirely. Others, far more sinister and disgusting, said that she had fled with the creature into the sewers, where they lived out the rest of their days in a dark, yet somehow happily twisted bliss. And of course people claimed they had seen their descendants. Some swore they had seen a creature known as the culvert among the pipes, supposedly with a face adorned with horns, its skin stained and torn with patches of cloth, as if from some macabre half-ancient armor. Some claimed to have seen it not only in the pipes, but outside the sewers as well. I never believed in this nonsense. Legends are as ephemeral as any other that become part of oral folklore over the years. But one thought kept nagging at me. Why did people believe it? Why did so many old people claim to have seen something strange and frightening in those very pipes that no one dared to look into? What if this legend was more than just a story to scare children? I was sure that I could debunk the culvert myth once and for all and prove to everyone that it was just a lie. The solution came to me late that night when I heard the story of culvert again. My friends laughed, teased me about how I would never dare to check what was really lurking in the sewers, and so I made a decision. I created a costume that I thought could represent culvert. A papier-mâché mask, antlers made from old branches and wire, tattered clothing, everything to create an appearance that would resemble what the old-timers described. I was not sure I would find the creature, and I did not know what was waiting for me below, but I decided that I wanted to feel it for myself. To follow in the footsteps of fear and destroy the illusion. I charged up the old camera I'd been using since my teens and turned it on. I wasn't exactly nervous, but there was a risk involved. These weren't just strange noises or forgotten legends. I was going deep to the very roots where no normal person would dare to step. Where the mystery begins, where something more is hidden. As soon as I entered the sewers, I felt a strange change in the air. It became damp and cold. With every step, the smell of rotting organic matter grew stronger, but there was something else, too. A strange sensation, as if the walls were beginning to narrow, as if this labyrinth of tunnels was not just empty space, but a living, breathing shell. I walked, carefully lighting the way with my flashlight, and every shadow, every sound seemed too loud, too bright. As I went deeper, the surroundings became more and more creepy. Smelly plastic bottles, empty beer cans, condom wrappers, and bags of garbage. But the further I went, the stranger the objects I came across. These were not just things. They were attributes of some sinister world. Overturned toys, mannequins without arms and legs, old torn teddy bears, as if someone had tried to leave traces of their life but suddenly disappeared. All this lay in dark corners, forgotten, abandoned, but at the same time could tell a whole story about who had once been here. And so, after walking a few dozen meters, I heard music. It was not something familiar, no, not cheerful melodies. but strange, slightly hissing music coming from the very depths of the sewer. The sounds, like a call, lured me further. I was tense, my steps became faster, but I could not help but follow this strange sound. There was a feeling that it was not from the world of the living, as if the sewer itself was singing to me, inviting me into its obscurantism. And so, when the sound reached its peak, I found myself in a huge, iron chamber. It was terrifying and inexplicable. The walls of the cell were covered in old, faded drawings, but the scariest thing was that there was a woman sitting in the center of the room. She looked to be about 60 years old, and she sat there in complete calm, as if everything around her was calm and familiar. She was dressed in a bright pink tracksuit that fit her perfectly. I walked up to her, unable to believe what I was seeing, but what I felt was far worse than any of the nonsense about Culvert. Her eyes were closed, and her body was completely still, with her head tilted at a strange, unnatural angle. At first, I couldn't understand what was happening. I touched her gently, and her head fell back lifelessly. She was dead. There was no smell of decay, no sign that she had been dead for a long time. And then something inside me began to change. I felt the presence of something else. Someone was watching me. As I stood there in that deathly silence, with the woman whose body was positioned in a strange way, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Everything around me seemed too strange, too wrong. I was sure that I had to leave this place. I turned on the camera and turned to leave, but as soon as I tried to take a step back, a strange coldness came over me, and I found it hard to breathe. It wasn't from the dampness, but from something else, invisible but tangible. I turned around and immediately felt the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. He was standing in front of me. It was the creature I had been trying to find for so long. Culvert. I couldn't believe my eyes. He was not as I had imagined. In legends, he was often described as having horns, spotted skin, and a face that could be both beautiful and hideous at the same time, but this creature before me was not what I expected. He was tall and incredibly thin, almost translucent. His skin was not only pale, but also painfully translucent. Black and purple veins like a spider web covered his body densely. He stood hunched over, as if his bones were not strong enough to support his body upright. His face was thin, with black, huge eyes that seemed unnatural, almost glassy. He was too quiet, too still to be real. Every movement he made was sluggishly nervous, as if he could not yet understand what was happening to his body. I felt my heart beat faster. This wasn't just a creature, this was something that shouldn't exist. I stood there, unsure of what to do. He looked at me with his glassy eyes, and I realized I wasn't prepared for what was coming. But before I could take a step back, he spoke. His voice was hoarse, as if he hadn't used it in years. He didn't say much, but his words stayed with me. You shouldn't have come here," he said, and his words seemed to echo in this eerie space. I realized that he wasn't evil. His gaze was full of fear. There was no malice in his eyes, only a strange uneasiness, as if he himself were a prisoner of this place. I thought that none of this could be true, that it was just a dream or some kind of nightmare. But he was real. Culvert didn't move. He just stood there, watching me. There was no movement, no threat, only anxiety, and it was transmitting itself to me. In that moment, I almost felt sorry for this creature. It was so alone, so alien, that its existence seemed impossible, but at the same time real. An entity that had no place in the world of men. I couldn't stay still. That fear in his eyes made me move. I tried to take a step back, but his body didn't move. He was standing right in front of the exit, blocking my way. But when I tried to turn around and leave, he stood in my way. He wasn't aggressive, but his presence was scary. I felt something pulling me back, forcing me to stay in this place where fear and terror reigned without any reason. I cried out as his body suddenly arched and his hands moved towards me, trying to catch me. I jumped back, but he was fast, incredibly fast. His hands grabbed me as if I was a doll in his hands. I tried to resist, but his strength was incredible. He held me so tightly that I could not move, and yet, despite his strength, I did not see any malice in him. It was frightening, but at the same time strangely reassuring. Something in his demeanor told me that he did not intend to harm me. Then he froze, as if he had suddenly remembered something. He let go of me and stepped aside, and then I noticed that his face had changed again. It had become even stranger. His eyes had suddenly become completely inhuman. The skull, as if bent at the corners, split, and from it emerged two distinct pins that I would never have thought to see in a human form. I was in shock. I tried to move again, but my legs wouldn't obey me. He was standing in front of me, no longer just a strange creature, but something terrifying, inexplicable, and, at the same time, not at all evil. "Go away," he whispered. I wanted to turn and run, but everything was in slow motion. My back was burning, and I could feel his eyes following my every move. And suddenly, as if I had come out of this trance, I rushed towards the exit without looking back. Fear filled me. All I wanted was to get out of this dark hole in which my life had found itself. I ran as fast as I could, not realizing that the end of the path was already in front of me, that I had almost reached the exit. But then, when I was already at the edge, I felt something grab me from behind. I tried to break free, but the creature I had just encountered was much faster than I could have imagined. Its cold, strong hands grabbed me like iron pincers and pulled me back into the dark abyss. I screamed, trying to break free, but my movements were too slow to get rid of this nightmare. Each of its movements was so precise that it seemed to me that it knew this place much better than I did. It knew how to escape, how to entangle and catch. In his arms, I felt all my strength fading. I was tired and scared, and even more confused. This couldn't be real. A creature that looked like the monster they described was holding me, and I was completely helpless. I found myself in the dark tunnel again, in that sewer labyrinth that seemed to have no end. The water under my feet flowed into the gutters, stinking and polluted. Along the way, there were the same debris, empty cans, old bags, and mannequins long forgotten by people. I tried not to think about what was around me and to focus only on my salvation. Run, just run. I had to find a way out, but the tunnels didn't end. I'd turn a corner, and where there had been light, there would be darkness again. I felt like the walls were closing in, making my path ever narrower and more unpleasant. The circles I made became more and more strange and chaotic. I tried to find some kind of landmark, but the tunnels were too uniform. Somewhere in the distance I could hear footsteps, Culvert's footsteps, getting closer with each passing second. I couldn't go on much longer. My body was at its limit and my mind was starting to give in. He was right behind me, his footsteps echoing in the deepest corners of my mind. I panicked and started running faster, trying not to think about what was happening. I tried to focus only on not letting myself fall. Suddenly I saw a turn. I ran towards it, hoping that this path would lead me to the exit, to the sunlight, to a world that was familiar and safe. I turned, and before me appeared a dead end, a wall of rubble and debris that was too high to climb. At that moment I felt something cold, like sticky hands wrapping around my legs. The creature was almost upon me. I screamed again, but this time my voice was weak, almost helpless. I didn't know what to do. I had to think of something. Fast. I started digging in the dirt, trying to find some way to get out, but there was nothing. I tried to resist, breaking free from his clutches, but no matter how hard I tried, he was stronger. Suddenly his hand covered my neck, and I felt his cold fingers penetrate my skin, squeezing my breath. I thought it was the end. I didn't know how much time had passed since I had ended up here in this hell, and my body was no longer able to resist. He was pulling me towards him, and there was nothing in his eyes except emptiness and despair. I tried to scream again, but instead I felt my strength leaving me. But then, when it seemed to me that I would not be able to survive, that the creature would take me with it into this dark world, I saw the light. It was small, barely noticeable, but still bright, like a saving ray. I grabbed the light and ran towards it. But it wasn't going to let me go. Culvert, desperate, kept chasing me. He didn't know how to stop. His movement was cruel and merciless, but I knew I had only one chance. I ran, leaving horror and darkness behind me. My legs barely obeyed me, but I couldn't stop. I had to get out. Finally, around one of the turns, I felt the light getting brighter, and suddenly a narrow gap opened up in front of me. I slipped out of it at the last moment when Culvert was only a few meters away from me. I found myself outside, in daylight. My whole world changed in an instant. The flash of light blinded me, and I couldn't believe I was out. I was outside, in a safe place. Everything was normal. I stood outside, breathing a sigh of relief, but fear clung to me. There was a rumble behind me, and I knew Culvert wasn't going to give in. This was just a reprieve, but I knew one thing. Now I had to find a way to end this. I didn't look back, didn't give myself time to think. I just ran. I ran like crazy. My whole body ached. Every muscle screamed with exhaustion, but I couldn't stop. The light at the end of the tunnel that I saw wasn't a light, but just another illusory consolation that deceived me again and again. I ran through the dark streets of the city, where neon lights pulsed in time with my rapid breathing, and the loud sounds of cars on the streets became more and more distorted and ominous. I had no goal, no sense of where I was going. I was simply running from what was chasing me, from what would not leave me alone. Culvert was getting closer, his presence in every step, in every sound, which seemed increasingly threatening to me. He was in no hurry, but he knew I could not escape. The people passing by paid no attention to me. The city was the same as always, a normal day, normal bustle, not a single glance in my direction. But I knew that for me, everything had changed. I was no longer a part of this world. I was like a stranger, running through familiar streets, but no longer feeling a part of this place. My consciousness became clouded. I ran along familiar roads, but despite my desperate haste, I felt that no matter which way I turned, I would still end up in the same place. All these streets, shops, people, everything became alien, scary, like a scene from a nightmare. I didn't know how much time had passed. Time had become an abstraction for me. But then, on one of the last streets, I noticed something strange. The entrance to some establishment, eclipsed by neon lights. A store I hadn't noticed before stood right in front of me, and I couldn't explain why, but something about it made me go in. It was small, barely noticeable, with a dim light barely illuminating the sign. Its glass doors opened slightly as I approached. I stood on the threshold, hesitating, but at some point I could no longer resist. It was like an instinctive decision. I crossed the threshold, and the door closed quietly behind me. It was empty inside. There was not a single customer, only shelves filled with strange things. Faces in old photographs flashed by, and objects that looked antique but at the same time completely alien. And in the corner, far away, stood an old man behind the counter. He looked at me with his small, insect-like eyes. "Do you want this to stop?" he asked, his voice deep and unfriendly, but there was something ominous about his words. He wasn't asking a question, he was making a statement. I didn't know how to answer. Everything in me screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't. I stood in front of him, as if under hypnosis, unable to move. "You're here for the same reason everyone else is here," he continued. "You're running because you can't escape what's behind you." I didn't understand what he was talking about. I couldn't understand how he knew what I was hiding. Why his words resonated so strongly in my head. "You have to choose," he added, slowly pulling an old book out from under the table. The pages were yellow and worn, as if they had been turned over the pages for millennia. He opened the book and showed me a picture, a dark labyrinth that was exactly like what I had seen in the dungeon, but with one important difference. The picture showed the exit. "Here it is," he said, "the exit you dream of, but it is not for everyone. Not everyone who goes there can return." I couldn't believe it. It was like another trap, another nightmare. But I couldn't leave. I couldn't give up on it, like everything inside me was screaming at me to take a step, to make something change. "What do I need to do?" I asked, even though I knew I wouldn't like the answer. "You must accept it, or you will keep running until you reach a place where there is no way back," the old man said, slowly closing the book. I looked around, feeling the pressure mounting. This strange store, its empty space, everything around me seemed to slow down. I felt like I couldn't trust this man, that this was all a trap, but what else could I do? I turned and looked at the old man. His face showed neither joy nor sadness. He was simply an observer, part of something far more ancient and sinister than I could have imagined, and I realized that I had no choice. If I didn't try now, I would run through these tunnels like a beast for the rest of my days. I was ready to take a step into the unknown, despite the fear that squeezed my heart. At that moment, I realized that this was not just a labyrinth, this was my punishment. The outside world no longer mattered. It was as if I was swallowed up in this strange space, where time and space lost their usual shape. Everything around me seemed so alien, so far from what I had once known. I kept walking, despite the cold sweat dripping from my forehead, despite the burning in my chest. The city where I had once felt human now seemed as alien as the tunnels I had run through. My consciousness was divided. On the one hand, it was still an ordinary place where I could meet old friends, walk along familiar streets. But on the other, I was no longer a part of this world. I couldn't stop, because I knew that if I slowed down, everything I was experiencing would be so real that I would drown in it. The pain, the suffering, the feeling that I could no longer control my actions, all of this was part of my new reality. Even when I tried to find salvation in a place that had recently seemed familiar, I knew I was no longer here. No matter how hard I tried to remember the way these streets breathed, the smells, the sounds, I knew that no amount of going back in time would save me. The sewers and their darkness were becoming my home. I didn't realize it until then, but with every step I took, I seemed to merge with what I was trying to leave behind. My attempt to escape these tunnels wasn't an attempt to return to normal life. I was already a part of what lurked beneath the surface. I was trapped, and that was the scariest thing of all. When I found myself standing in front of the same building as hours ago, I felt the horror wash over me. It was quiet, too quiet. I could feel everything around me frozen. There was this strange, unpleasant taste under my fingernails. I felt every movement of my body slow down as if it were resisting its own nature. Everything inside me screamed that I shouldn't be here. "You haven't chosen," I heard the old man's voice. But he wasn't in the shop now. It was coming from somewhere behind me, from somewhere in the very center of this horror. I couldn't believe my ears. The same voice, the same confident tone, but it was different, distorted. It was like it didn't apply to me, like it was just part of this world I was trying to understand. As if by intuition, I began to move on, sliding between the houses, feeling the walls shrinking, the space around me shrinking, the dark web of this world slowly wrapping around me. I didn't know where to go, but it didn't matter. There was only one thing: not to weaken, not to fall. I took a few more steps, and suddenly I was blinded by the light. The horizon line that had seemed impossible to me before was now right in front of me. It was the very light I had been looking for so long. But at the moment when I was ready to jump into it, I felt something was stopping me. My strength was gone. I lost control. My hand reached out for that light, but I couldn't reach it. And then, when I could go no further, when the darkness swallowed me, I heard it again, that voice, the same one that had been following me from the very beginning. "Did you really think this would be easy?" he said, and there was less of a threat in his words than regret. I stood there in that darkness and knew that this time I couldn't leave. All I knew, all I had left was in front of me, an eternal shadow beyond which I could see neither beginning nor end. At that moment I realized that there was no way out. All I could do was accept this emptiness. And then I started walking again. Not with such a desperate goal, not with the hope of salvation. I simply walked, and only my steps echoed in this ominous world. There was no longer the same search. I was not the same person I had been in the beginning. I was part of something bigger, something that was not connected to this world. And maybe this was not my punishment. Maybe this was my path. With every step I took, I felt the darkness closing in on me. The walls of the canal closing in, closer and closer, as if I were part of it, part of this nightmare. My legs moved mechanically. Each step felt heavy and awkward, but I couldn't stop. Where there had once been walls, there was now only emptiness, where no light could penetrate even the smallest cracks. It was as if all reality had disappeared, leaving only me and these cold underground tunnels that did not lead to the future, but only deepened the fear. I didn't know how much time had passed since I had first come here. Time was losing its meaning. I began to notice my skin taking on a strange, sickly hue, as if all the energy had been drained from me. But worst of all, even the shadow of my past was slowly fading, as if I was losing touch with who I once was. Was I even someone? Were my memories real, or was it all just part of this strange, murky reality? The past wouldn't let me go. Every now and then I would see faces again. Faces of people I once knew, faces that were close to me. I would see my friends, my family, their hands reaching out to me, but there was no life in their eyes, only emptiness. I would try to reach them, but they would disappear like smoke, as if they had never existed. These images, these memories haunted me, but they were so vague that I couldn't tell what was real and what. I felt like I had lost something important, something that could bring me back to the real world, but that was no longer possible. All I knew was that I was here, and nothing more. How did I end up in this labyrinth? Why was I the one chosen to be part of this meaningless, torn reality? There were no answers. All I felt was a heavy, suffocating absence. I tried to remember the moment when everything changed, when I was still alive, when I was able to feel. But that moment was long lost, washed away by the waves of this nightmare. I walked and walked, not knowing where, but as if instinct told me that there was a path I had to take. Could I hope for salvation? And even if salvation existed, what would it look like in this hell? I didn't know. When I finally reached another turn in this bottomless labyrinth, I suddenly thought I saw light. It was strange, because light here in the dungeon should not exist. It was dim, barely noticeable, but it was enough for me to feel again that strange hope that slid across my skin, forcing me to move forward. But the closer I got, the more the light became alien and distorted. It wasn't like normal light, it was dirty, flickering, as if I were looking through a cloudy glass. Something was wrong, but I kept moving. Maybe I was already on the verge of despair. Maybe I couldn't contain my thirst for some kind of exit, even if that exit was just an illusion. Suddenly, the light disappeared, and I found myself in a dark, cold room. This world was underground, but it seemed too familiar. I didn't understand how it was possible, but it was. I was standing in a huge hall, as if in the basement of an old house. Around me were only fragments of old furniture, empty boxes, torn fabrics, and all this smelled of old mold and stale air. There was a figure standing in the center of the room. It was dark, its essence unclear, like a shadow barely visible in the dim light. I couldn't figure out what it was, but as always, I knew it was something not of this world. It was more than just a creature. It was a symbol of what I had lost, that I had become part of this world, that I could no longer return. As soon as I stepped onto the floor of the room, the shadow moved. As if sensing my presence, I froze. My eyes could not tear themselves away from this figure, which was slowly but surely approaching me. With each step, its shape became clearer. It was the culvert, the monstrous image I had sought. But now I saw it not as something to be conquered. I saw it as a part of myself, a dark reflection of my own fall. I had become what I feared, but in that moment I realized that everything had been predetermined. I wasn't looking for something to escape from. I was here to meet this creature face to face, and only in that moment could I understand that my whole life, everything that had brought me here, was just part of this terrible path from which I could no longer break away. The creature stood before me, its eyes soulless, and I knew it meant me no harm. It was part of me, part of this shadow that had forever darkened my life. And then, in the shadows, I knew. My journey was over. I didn't end up in this place by accident. Everything that happened brought me here. My entire life, my mistakes, my aspirations, my search for something more, it was all just preparation for the moment when I would come face to face with Culvert, with something that should not exist. It was an end I did not expect, but which became inevitable when I crossed the line. My hands were shaking, and my heart was beating like crazy in my chest. I was standing in the very room where the shadow had become an integral part of me. It wasn't just a meeting, it was a collision I couldn't avoid. I was a part of that shadow, just as it was a part of me. I had become what I had been searching for, what I had been trying to hide all these years. I was Culvert. My skin no longer felt alive, it was cold as stone. I looked around, and this whole place seemed so familiar that I couldn't help but think that I had been here once before. But then, maybe I hadn't seen it. Maybe I didn't know. that I was in the very center of darkness. Every crack in the walls, every piece of debris on the floor, every creak of those old wooden beams, it had all become part of what I had been forced to accept. I tried to go back, but every step back became more and more impossible. The process of returning, which had once seemed so obvious, now seemed so distant, as if it were an illusion that had never existed. All that was left was to move forward, no matter how hard it was. The creature in front of me didn't move, it just stood there and looked at me, as if it knew everything that had happened to me. It was a mirror, reflecting back my fear, my doubts, everything I had tried to hide. And I knew I couldn't defeat it, because I already was it. It was a terrible revelation, the realization that I had become part of what I had tried to escape. Every sound, every movement in this place now seemed like a hollow echo of what I felt inside. I could hear my thoughts, but they brought me no comfort. I felt the sinister power hidden in these pipes, and the stale air consuming everything around me, leaving me with this creature and my own demons. I was trapped here, unable to return, unable to escape this nightmare, but deep down I knew it was my choice. I had come here, and now I had to accept my fate. The being in front of me seemed to move. Its movements were slow but sure, as if it knew I couldn't escape. I felt its presence filling me, as if it was becoming a part of me, and I was becoming a part of it. I tried to take a step back, but my legs wouldn't obey me, as if the channels of this place were clinging to every cell of my body. My thoughts were in disarray, but in the midst of all this chaos, I realized that I could no longer live hiding from this. I had already become what I feared. I had become part of this world, part of this shadow, and there was no turning back. I could only keep moving forward, despite the horror that was engulfing me. And then the creature came to me with its lifeless eyes and writhing body, and I realized that it was not my enemy. It was my reflection. It was something I had long hidden, something I had long rejected. All I could do was acknowledge it and accept it. The dark world around me was closing in, and I knew that at some point it would all disappear. But what would happen after I passed that final frontier? I didn't know. And maybe this was the best I could imagine. In that shadow there was no room for pity, no room for regret. There was only this being, this reflection, and I who stood before it, no longer knowing who I was. My mind went dark, and Colbert stood there as if he was ready to take me with him to this new world where there was no more pain, no more fear. Everything was swallowed up by this shadow, this oblivion, and I no longer knew what was next. I felt the darkness envelop me, and I realized I couldn't fight it anymore. All I could do was accept it, and the darkness swallowed me. Story 4. When I first moved to Appalachia, I thought this was the place to rebuild myself. My life in the city was falling apart piece by piece. The loss of a job, the end of a relationship, a complete disappointment in myself. I thought I needed solitude, and that this cabin in the Appalachian woods would help me find peace. It was old but cozy, located far from people and noisy streets. The only neighbor was the forest, quiet and peaceful, which for me was a blessing. The place seemed perfect, or so I thought, until I started to see what was happening here. In the first days, I felt like isolation was exactly what I needed. I was alone, but there was something comforting about it. Forest paths, fresh air, time to think and organize my thoughts. All this helped me calm down. I walked a lot, chopped wood, restored the hut. In the evenings, by the fire, I sometimes reflected on my life. But all these thoughts could not overcome the anxiety that followed me like a shadow. Things started to get weird pretty quickly. The first thing I noticed was something small, but it still made me wary. I always locked my doors before going to bed out of fear and habit. I loved the sense of security this routine gave me. However, when I woke up, I began to find that one of the doors, the back one, which usually didn't cause any problems, was slightly open. At first, I didn't pay much attention to it. Maybe I forgot to close it myself, tiredness, stress, nighttime thoughts. But after a few nights, the door kept opening. This could all be the result of my inattention. I knew I needed to calm down. I tried not to think about it, but with each passing day, the doubts grew stronger. I began checking all the locks twice, maybe even 3 times. I put the keys in different places to make sure I hadn't missed anyone. But even then, as soon as I fell asleep, I felt like there was someone standing behind the door. I knew it wasn't true, that I was just driving myself into paranoia, but the fear was deep down, somewhere I couldn't control. At first, I began to attribute my feelings to the solitude. I didn't interact with people, didn't see faces, didn't hear conversations. This affected my psyche. Being alone in such solitude is not the same as being alone in a city apartment surrounded by familiar things and people. It was quiet and empty. At first, it was even pleasant, but with each passing day, the tension inside me only grew. I constantly felt as if someone was watching me, as if someone found strange pleasure in my anxiety. One morning, after a particularly sleepless night, I walked into the kitchen to find that my coffee mug had been broken. It didn't look like an accident. The pieces were neatly arranged as if someone had deliberately chosen to do so. I couldn't believe my eyes. Why would someone take the time to carefully break my favorite glass and arrange the pieces? I quickly dismissed it as an unfortunate accident and tried to forget about it again, but the more I tried to ignore it, the more unsettling it became. After that, other strange things started happening. My book storage area on the shelf suddenly looked perfectly tidy, even though I had never alphabetized my books. I had always been a bit of a mess about them and had never stacked them so neatly. This was another sign that something was wrong with the place. My sense of security was crumbling, and anxiety was growing instead. I couldn't explain how this had happened. I live alone. Who would do this? A few days later, I felt something had changed again. For a long time, I couldn't figure out what it was. However, when I walked past the photographs on the walls again, I noticed that the faces of my loved ones had changed slightly. The people in the pictures now seemed a little less smiling. Their eyes seemed to avoid meeting my gaze. I couldn't understand what was happening, but it felt as if someone was slowly changing the things around me. Something elusive that couldn't be explained began to torment my psyche. There were moments when I simply stood in the room and it seemed to me that something or someone was present, even though I was alone. Sometimes, watching the shadows move across the floor, I felt anxiety growing in my chest, as if someone from another reality was watching me. I could not explain it and did not know how to cope with it. I was alone, and despite this, it seemed that this house, this hut, were not empty. There was something else in them, imperceptible to the eyes, but felt in every cell of the body. I tried to distract myself by going on long walks in the woods, getting lost in the trails, hoping to find some clarity, but something always pulled me back to the cabin. My head was full of thoughts and worries. It didn't give me peace, didn't allow me to feel safe. I doubted my sanity more and more with each passing minute. Every moment was filled with a strange, incomprehensible fear. The back door kept opening, and I didn't know what that meant. I checked all the locks, locked the doors, but the anxiety grew. I felt something dark filling the air around me, as if the forest, once calm and peaceful, was beginning to become alien, hostile. The nights became especially hard. The sounds of the forest, which had once calmed me, now became a source of fear. The shadows I saw through the window seemed too real, too solid. I doubted more and more that I would be able to cope with it. However, at that moment, I could not even imagine that there was something much more terrible behind it. A few weeks passed and I was already getting used to being alone, although everything was not as calm as it seemed at first. But the more time I spent in this hut, the more oddities I noticed. I tried to convince myself that this was simply the result of prolonged isolation, that every person at some point begins to notice things that do not make sense. But these little things were no longer so harmless. Every day the changes became more and more obvious. One morning I woke up and found a broken cup in the kitchen, although I clearly remembered leaving it intact on the shelf. The shards weren't just lying on the floor, they were neatly arranged in a circle, as if someone was trying to create a pattern. It was something I couldn't explain. I still believed that it was the result of fatigue or inattention, but the oddities were becoming more and more obvious. Just like with the doors, I started noticing small changes again. At first, it was a small concern when I woke up and realized that my bookshelf wasn't just slightly different, it had been reorganized. All the books were in perfect alphabetical order, even though I was never that neat. I didn't know what to think. At first, I even thought that I had accidentally done it myself while unconscious. But how could that be? There were too many coincidences. Every event became stranger, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was there, even when I was alone. I stopped feeling safe in my hut. I checked the windows, the doors, making sure everything was closed, but the feeling of unease did not leave me. I noticed shadows moving around the room when I could not explain their origin. Sounds that I had previously ignored now became ominous. The leaves outside the windows rustled somehow strangely, and at night I found it difficult to fall asleep. Every rustle made my skin break out in a cold sweat. I could not understand what was happening. Everything seemed normal, but something was wrong. As night fell, I began to wonder if there was more to this house, to this forest, than just the silence. I tried to rationalize. Maybe it was just the product of stress, my solitude, my isolation. But the more I tried to understand what was happening, the more I felt a growing anxiety permeating every cell of my body. One night, when I returned from a long walk in the woods, I noticed that my photographs on the walls had been slightly altered. The faces of my friends and relatives seemed unnatural when I looked at them, as if they were in some kind of trance. Their eyes slightly turned away from me, their smiles dimmed. I went closer, checking each photo. Everything was fine, but what I felt was inexplicable. These photos were familiar, but something about them had changed. At first I tried to write it off as a nervous condition, but now it was no longer so easy to ignore all these moments. Fear began to crawl through my veins. I began to fear these snake-like movements in the dark corners of the room. Every sound that could be something more than just the wind or an animal. Once I was confident in my psyche, but now every day turned into a fight with my own consciousness. I felt my senses failing me more and more. I didn't know if I could trust what I was seeing. Reality began to blur before my eyes. The shadows on the walls seemed a little more tangible, and the space around me seemed too dense and full of hidden threats. I tried to hold myself together, hoping that it would all pass, that I was just too tired. But every day this horror became a part of my world. One morning I discovered something else strange. In the kitchen, in the same place where I often cooked, I found a note. It was handwritten, and the handwriting was unfamiliar. The note said, "You forgot again." It shocked me so much that I was speechless. I quickly looked through all the rooms, checked every corner, looked under the beds and behind the curtains. But I was alone. I couldn't understand what it meant. Who could have left such a note? My first thought was that it was a joke. Maybe one of the locals decided to have fun with me. But I knew that no one could be here. I was alone. And yet, how to explain these words? I didn't know what to make of this note. It seemed unnatural, ominous. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me, watching something, and that this wasn't just an accident. I checked the doors and windows again, but somehow I couldn't feel as calm as before. One question kept spinning in my head. Who was here if I wasn't there? This was the beginning of what would soon become worse. Every day I would wake up with a feeling of anxiety that I had no control over what was happening around me. The strangeness was piling up, and I didn't know how to stop it. Every day my anxiety grew. It no longer seemed like a coincidence. It was no longer a simple misunderstanding. I increasingly caught myself thinking that something was wrong here. I can't say exactly how it all started, but I understood one thing. I was surrounded by a force that I couldn't explain. A force that played so skillfully with my perceptions and feelings that even the most obvious things began to seem strange and alien. I felt like someone or something was watching me all the time. At first it was just a small sense of unease that wouldn't go away, but over time it grew stronger. My nighttime vigils grew longer, and the shadows of the night grew more ominous. I began to feel reality shifting and changing. It felt like it was no longer stable, and I couldn't figure out what was happening. Then I noticed new changes. For example, I would wake up in the morning and suddenly notice that something was wrong in my house. The windows were slightly open, although I was sure that I closed them at night. These seemed like trifles, but they made me doubt my memory. There was a feeling that something was changing the surrounding space, but doing it very smoothly, imperceptibly, so that no one could understand that it was happening. But the most disturbing things happened to the items I left on my shelves or tables. One morning, when I came home from a long day, I noticed that my bookshelf had been carefully moved, stacked in an order I knew I wouldn't put them in. I couldn't remember the last time I checked these books or even rearranged them. I began to look at every detail, and with each passing second I became more and more afraid. When I looked into the mirrors, I saw not only myself, but also something else. Maybe it was a trick of the light, maybe I was already hallucinating, but I felt like there was something else hiding behind my reflection. And not one, but several. This feeling grew like a fog, not giving a clear perception. I could not shake the feeling that not everything I saw was real. It seemed to me that someone was standing right behind me, as if I had become a part of something bigger that could come at any moment. And then one day, returning home yet again, I saw that my bed was made, as if someone had just run their hands over it. My bedding wasn't just neatly folded, it was crumpled and shorn, as if someone had sat there, on it, in my absence. It was impossible to explain. I could have sworn that I had left it in complete disarray, but now everything was different. So, I started looking for ways to figure out what was really going on. I set up cameras in different corners of the house, hoping that they would help find an explanation, but when I watched the footage, I couldn't believe my eyes. Hours of footage showed empty rooms where nothing was happening. There was no one, there was no movement, just me and the space. I was seeing myself, but was I really seeing and could I trust the footage? Despite this, the strangeness continued. A few days passed and I noticed changes in my photos again. This was the moment when I began to panic. Each night they became more alien. The faces in the photos that were once familiar to me now looked blurrier, as if they did not belong in this world. The smiles on them began to fade, the eyes empty and unfriendly. I could have sworn that they were changing, but that was impossible. Were my eyes deceiving me? Or was something or someone replacing my memories? With each new day, my experiences became more and more intense and unbearable. It was not just a feeling of anxiety. It was a feeling that I was losing touch with reality, with what once seemed clear and stable to me, like in a dark corridor where every step you take seems to you a step into emptiness, into uncertainty. I tried to cope with it. Sometimes I convinced myself that it was all in my head, that I was just tired, that my own isolation was weighing me down. But the next day, something new always happened. Everything became even more confusing. Just when I thought I understood what was happening, I was faced with something completely impossible. Sometimes I felt like someone was in my house, but I was alone. No matter how hard I tried to find an explanation for these events, each one led me to more and more confusion. I felt trapped in a closed space, and every attempt to find a way out only confused me more. And then, when I was almost at the brink of despair, I found the note again. This time it was on the pillow. I opened it, and this time the text was slightly different, but the feelings it evoked were exactly the same. You forgot again. My world continued to change, and each morning brought new unpleasant discoveries. This was no longer just the strange behavior of things, not minor disturbances. Every second I felt how reality around me was shifting, breaking and recreating, forcing me to doubt my own feelings and perceptions. I did not know what exactly was happening, but I could no longer imagine my life without this nightmare that stretched and swallowed up more and more space. The notes kept appearing. They were everywhere, on the table, on the pillow, on the bookshelf, even in the most unexpected places where I knew I hadn't left them. I realized that no one else could have left them, and I had to ask myself more and more often, what if I had written them myself? But how could that be? I could never remember. Even when I solved the problem, it seemed to reappear like a cyclical process in which I was only a part, with no chance of escape. My attempts to find answers became desperate. I began to examine every corner of the house, checking every detail. I looked again and again at places where there shouldn't have been anything. Windows, doors, corners of the ceiling. I checked everything, tried to understand everything. But every time I thought I had found a clue, it turned out to be a lie. It was like a trap from which there was no escape. I set up cameras all over the house, watching every movement, every object, to prove to myself that this wasn't just my mind playing tricks on me. But watching the footage provided no answers. The cameras captured empty rooms, unremarkable nights where everything remained still, as if I were trapped in a world devoid of any time or logic. The silence in the footage was almost unbearable. My journal became the only place where I could somehow calm my fears, where I could write down my thoughts so that they wouldn't drown me. But even my entries became increasingly chaotic. Once clear with organized thoughts, they now turned into disordered scribbles in which it was impossible to find meaning. I wrote and reread my words, but they seemed alien, not belonging to me. It all resembled a terrible dream in which I was not a spectator but a protagonist. I tried to control myself, but the thought of losing control filled me with terror. I began to doubt my sanity. There were times when I would look for things and I couldn't find them. I would know I had left them in a certain place, but they were gone. When I returned, they would seem to have disappeared, or they would appear in a different place, as if someone had purposefully changed their location. And there it was again, another note. This one was different, too direct and clear, as if it had been written not for me, but specifically for me to feel the sense of horror. "You forgot again." The words seemed familiar, but I could no longer pinpoint when they had been written. I shuddered when I realized it was in my own handwriting. But I couldn't leave messages like that to myself, could I? Something was happening, and it was more than just an inexplicable series of events. I checked the cameras again, but nothing had changed. Everything was the same. The silence, the empty rooms, my reflection in the mirror. Nothing that could explain what was happening. And when I looked at my collection of photographs again, I noticed that one of them was distorted. The faces of the people in the picture were blurred, as if someone had spilt ink over their images. But it wasn't just distortion. It was something alive. I could feel those faces looking at me, mocking me as if they knew something I didn't. Then I felt a chill run down my spine, and I realized that the people I knew were no longer in the photographs. The people who had once been in those pictures were gone. But they were here, in the house. I could feel their presence in the air. Or at least, I thought I could. I had almost lost the ability to distinguish between what was real and what was not. I was increasingly trapped in my own consciousness. My mind, which once considered me the master of my life, now seemed completely out of control. I began to doubt my every step, every decision, every thought. This house had become a prison in which I was trapped, and the longer I was here, the more it became clear that I myself had become part of this trap. And as always, when I thought that all this could be explained, that I would find a way out, another note appeared. This time, I felt a shudder run through my body. I picked it up, and again the same words. "Don't look under the floorboards." With each word, my certainty that I was trapped grew stronger. I knew I should leave it alone, but I couldn't. The further I went, the more I felt that only there under the floorboards could I find the answers. But what if I was never supposed to look for them? What if they were the answers I was so afraid to find? My mind fought against this feeling of anxiety, but I knew I couldn't escape it. I was doomed in this house, in this cycle that would never end. Story 5. I remember the ride that day. My gaze slid out the taxi windows until the valley stretched out into an endless abyss of gray hills. Far below, where the sun shone dimly, stood the orphanage. This place was my last hope, my last chance at a new life, even though I wasn't sure I wanted it. But with every kilometer I traveled along those bleak roads, I began to doubt that everything would go as planned. My journey to this place was slow, and the depressing atmosphere that surrounded the shelter made me feel more and more alien. There was only one question in my head: why? Why was I chosen to work here, among these sad people and gray landscapes? Memories of the bright and bustling life in the big city suddenly seemed so distant and unreal. The orphanage. When I first heard about it, it all seemed promising. The idea seemed good. Take care of orphans, give them a roof over their heads and a chance at a normal life. But something was wrong. I felt it intuitively, although I couldn't figure out what exactly the problem was. The dark atmosphere kept following me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this orphanage than just a home for children. When I stepped on the threshold of this building, the first thing that greeted me was the director. His smile was sincere, at least on the surface. He looked friendly, but there was some coldness in his gaze, some hidden, elusive meaning. He met me as if I were a savior, as if my hands could unravel all their secrets. I was tired after a long journey, but I did not allow myself to relax. Something made me keep my distance. It was not that I was afraid, no. Rather, there was a feeling that I should be on guard. When he spoke of helpers, this phrase sounded somehow ridiculous, and my body sensed something strange. The process of settling in was fast, almost painfully fast. I watched his every move, listened carefully to everything he said. It was unclear why, but it seemed to me that every step in this house gave off some hidden meaning, some hidden fear. His words seemed to merge into something other than ordinary conversation. I couldn't shake the feeling that this whole process was part of some kind of game, and I wasn't sure that I would ultimately like this game. "You have to make yourself at home," he said, and something about that sentence made me freeze for a moment. A cozy place, and then realizing that it wasn't really a cozy place. He was too sure that I would accept everything he said as true, but I didn't want to give in. I wasn't just looking for a place to hide, I was looking for answers. A small boy, Roger, appeared from behind the door like a ghost, silent but with a special look in his eyes, an inner tension that I could feel. This was not a child, but something more. There was more information in his eyes than I could process. I kept my distance, despite the polite smile he gave me. He was already too old for his age, his gaze too meaningful. I tried not to give in. I tried to think that all this was just my imagination, but I couldn't shake the strange feeling. The boy and the director, they were connected by something unknown, something sinister. I began to doubt myself, but I also couldn't deny that something was definitely wrong here. When Derek offered to show me the room, I couldn't refuse. We walked into the hallway, and I felt the air grow thicker. Suddenly, it seemed like the whole house was watching me, like the walls knew my thoughts and were about to read them. The room I entered seemed completely ordinary, but this feeling of hidden menace did not leave me. I lay on my bed, trying to calm myself, but inside me there was this growing feeling that I was just part of a much bigger plan. I didn't understand what was happening, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Everything was too right, too structured. Every gesture, every look seemed rigged, and it scared me. I tried to think of something else, but the thought that this shelter was more than just a shelter haunted me, and every moment spent in this place felt like a step into a dark abyss that I could not understand. The next day was business as usual, or so it seemed. I was trying to get used to the rhythm of the new place, to get acquainted with its rules and people. Derek led me through the long corridors of the shelter, telling me about the rules and tasks. I listened, although the words barely reached my consciousness, since everything around me seemed somehow distorted, alien. I tried to remember that I would have to help the children with their studies, spend time with them, and do everything that was required of me, but deep down this strange atmosphere continued to bother me. Everything was so sterile, so neat, that even people's smiles seemed artificial, as if they had been trained to show them on a schedule. I couldn't shake the feeling that these people were hiding something. Everything looked too right. Roger met me again in the kitchen. He was quiet, silent, almost invisible. And yet I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me, that his eyes weren't just seeing me, but somehow penetrating my very soul. It was uncomfortable when he looked at me, as if he knew something about my past, my fears, my doubts. His gaze was unwavering, and my body was seared by it, as if he could read me even when I didn't say anything. I tried to ignore his strange behavior, but the more I tried to ignore it, the stronger the feeling became that something was wrong. Something didn't add up in this house. Every corner, every glance hid some unknown danger. I couldn't figure out what exactly was scaring me, but my instincts were set to alarm. After dinner, when everything seemed to have calmed down a bit, I decided to take a walk around the shelter grounds, hoping to clear my head and get rid of these thoughts, at least a little. But as soon as I stepped outside, I was immediately overcome by a strange feeling. It was too quiet in this place. There were no birds singing, no rustling of trees, only silence. A dead silence that seemed to swallow up all living things. I walked along a path that led deeper into the garden, and with every step it became darker. Only one lamp illuminated the way, and its dim light seemed unnatural to me, as if it did not belong to this world. I stopped and looked around, trying to find something familiar, something that could calm me. But instead, I felt that cold again, wrapping itself around me from all sides. I turned around and found myself being followed. It was Derek. He was standing at the entrance to the building looking at me, his gaze intense as always, but this time there was something strange in his eyes. I couldn't quite place it, but his presence scared me. I hurried back into the building, and as soon as I stepped through the door, a wave of anxiety washed over me. I tried to calm myself down, to make my mind understand that all of this was just my imagination, but I couldn't. Every day in this place it became more and more difficult for me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was irreparably wrong. That question haunted me at night. Why did I feel like I couldn't trust any of these people? What were they hiding, and what was this place hiding? And what were these strange things happening to the kids in this orphanage? Roger! It was like he could see right through me. I thought about him for a long time, thinking about the things he'd said, how he acted so different from other kids. He was like an old man in a little boy's body. I thought about what he had said, something he had casually mentioned about this place not being what it seemed. But his words had been empty, as if he didn't want to explain anything. And again in my head I heard that inner voice that said, "Don't trust them." But what exactly had happened to me? Why couldn't I just live and work here like a normal person? I couldn't figure it out, but I felt like my intuition was right. A few days passed, and one evening I had to stay late at the shelter to finish some work. I was sitting in the office leafing through some paperwork when I felt a presence again. Someone was standing at the door. I looked up and saw Roger standing silently in the dark hallway again. His eyes were brighter than usual, and he stepped into the office, and something about his movements struck me as odd. He was like a ghost, not belonging to this world. But I couldn't look away. Something inside me made me keep him in my sight, and in that moment I realized I couldn't leave this shelter without understanding what was going on here. The next day I decided I needed to know more about what was going on behind the walls of this shelter. There was something unsettling about the way Derek and Roger acted, as if everything that happened here was part of some game I couldn't quite fit into. I felt like this house, its people, and its rules were hiding something important from me, and I was determined to find out. I began to carefully explore the orphanage grounds, slowly and trying not to attract too much attention to myself. They were mostly old buildings with dimly lit hallways and empty rooms. The furniture was old but well kept, and on the walls hung paintings that seemed unusually bright and strange to me. I couldn't quite explain it, but there was something about them that made me uneasy. They depicted people, but these people were somehow not real. Distorted faces, tense poses, too bright colors. It seemed like the artists who painted them didn't know how to convey emotions, and so their works looked surreal and a little scary. I walked up to one of the paintings and looked at it more closely. It was a scene of a family sitting around a dinner table. They were all smiling, but their smiles were so forced that they looked like grimaces. Something was wrong with this image. I quickly looked away, trying not to think about it. That evening after dinner I found myself in the empty hallway again. My steps echoed in this vast space, and it seemed to me that the walls were narrowing, as if swallowing me up. The place seemed even more isolated in the silence of the night, and I could not shake the feeling that I was alone in this huge house. I decided to take a look in the basement. It was the darkest place in the orphanage, and although I couldn't explain why, I was always curious about what was behind its doors. In the hallway next to the stairs, I noticed a familiar silhouette. It was Roger. He was standing at the foot of the stairs as if he was waiting for me. His gaze was calm, but there was some hidden meaning in it that I couldn't understand. As I approached, he stepped back and smiled slightly. It wasn't a normal smile. It was like a test, as if he knew what I was thinking and was testing whether I would dare to go further. "I don't recommend going down there," he said quietly, but his words sounded like a warning. I paused for a moment, thinking, why did he say that? What was there that I should be afraid of? Still, I decided that I had to find out what was lurking in that dark place. I walked past Roger without saying a word and headed for the stairs. He didn't follow me, but simply stood and watched until I disappeared into the darkness. As I walked down the steps, I felt the cold seeping into every cell of my body. The air in the basement was musty, damp, and despite the smell that penetrated my nose, I still kept going. I stopped at the door at the end of the hallway. It was a large wooden door with rusty metal hinges. The vents at the bottom of the door were covered in dust, and a strange smell came from them, as if there was something alive in the basement. Taking a deep breath, I opened the door. In the darkness of the basement, I could barely make out the shapes of objects, but something held me back. I headed toward the window, through which a dim light barely penetrated outside, and as I passed, I noticed something that made me stop. There were a few old boxes on the floor. They were standing in a corner neatly stacked, as if someone was hiding them from prying eyes. I brought my hands to the boxes, opening them one by one. Inside I found old clothes, toys, and a few other strange objects. But what really shocked me was that among these things, I noticed photographs. They were photographs of children, but their faces were blurred, and many of them had something strange about them. The children in these photographs had empty looks, as if they did not feel anything. But there was something else, something about these pictures that made my skin crawl. I held one of the photographs up close and examined it. It was a photograph of Roger, but his face was not as I had seen it. He was older, his expression hard and cold. It was not the face of a child. It was the face of a creature I could not understand. As I tried to put the photo back in the box, something made me stop. I felt someone standing next to me. I turned my head slowly and saw Derek standing by the door, his eyes dark and his lips stretched into a strange smile. "Did you find what you were looking for?" His voice was low, almost a whisper, but there was no fear or pity in it. It was the voice of a man who knew that I had realized too late that I had fallen into a trap. I felt the blood drain from my face and panic washed over me. My body felt paralyzed with fear. I didn't know what to do, but one thing was clear. I couldn't just leave here alive if I didn't reveal this secret. The darkness that enveloped the orphanage grew more tangible with each passing day. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, but I didn't know what it was. Everything around me felt strange, and every step I took felt wrong. I couldn't ignore the strangeness that surrounded me anymore. Derek and Roger continued to act as if they were above everything, and that everything in this place revolved around them. I couldn't understand why I stayed here, in this house full of shadows and fear, but something wouldn't let me leave. Something inside me forced me to keep searching for answers, despite all the warnings my mind was giving me. One morning, when the whole house was still immersed in silence, I decided to explore the shelter grounds again. I needed to understand what was going on. Every day I felt more and more lost, understood less and less what was happening, and doubted more and more that I was safe. I started in the basement. This time I wasn't going to avoid it like before. I decided I needed to find out what was down there. As I descended the stairs, I was hit by the familiar smell again. Damp, musty air, heavy and foggy. But now I knew what was waiting for me down there. I kept walking, though every movement was filled with anxiety. I went to where I had found the boxes earlier, and now, gathering my strength, I decided to look inside one of them. Suddenly, I came across a photograph that seemed to have been left especially for me. It was of Roger, but not as I was used to seeing him. He was an adult, with empty eyes and a blank expression on his face. His figure was tense, and I felt something unpleasant creep into my consciousness, but that was not all. There was a note under the photograph. Written in clumsy handwriting, it read, "He will be yours. He must be yours." The words instantly made me feel vulnerable, like I was trapped. I quickly put the box back in its place and, without stopping, hurried back up to the house. I knew I had to be careful, but I was also hungry to know more. I couldn't let this go. My eyes kept returning to Roger and Derek and their strange behavior. Something was wrong. They were clearly hiding something. I had to figure it out. Derek was there that day. He was almost invisible, but I felt the coldness in the room. He knew I was in the basement. He knew I was digging into something I shouldn't be touching. I tried not to show my excitement, but inside I was a storm. I knew I was being forced step by step into something I couldn't turn back from. He said nothing, but his presence was ominous. I felt his gaze piercing my very soul, tearing apart my attempts to hide my fear. He was here for a reason. He knew I was looking for answers. He knew I would eventually get to the truth, and that seemed to suit him. As he passed me, His hand brushed my shoulder, and I felt his touch leave an icy mark on my skin. I wanted to pull away, but I couldn't. I was hypnotized by this man. He was too attractive for me to ignore, but there was something destructive in that attraction, something dark that was pulling me into the abyss. Then I realized that I was already a part of their world. I could no longer return to my old life. I had become a part of something that existed beyond my understanding, and fear only strengthened my steps on this strange, dark path. I decided I wouldn't back down. I couldn't. I couldn't afford to turn a blind eye to everything that was happening. I had to know the truth, no matter how terrible it was. The darkness that surrounded this house was becoming more and more tangible, and I felt like at some point it would swallow me whole. But I couldn't leave. I couldn't escape what was here. And the moment I realized that all the answers were right in front of me, I felt my own destiny begin to change. I decided that I would search for answers until the end, no matter the consequences. Everything around me screamed that this was not where I should be, but I could no longer choose another path. With each step I sank deeper into this world that was impossible to leave, and I understood that I would not be able to find a way out until I knew the whole truth. It had been a few days since I had begun to sink into the foggy reality of this place. Each day had become more difficult, as if the very atmosphere of the shelter was trying to break me. I couldn't shake the feeling of being trapped, and the more I tried to understand what was going on here, the more confusing it became. I couldn't find any answers or even any indication that this was all just a nightmare. Derek continued his games, and Roger became more and more strange with each passing day. I couldn't help but notice how his gaze became cold and calculating. There was no joy or happiness in his eyes, only an emptiness that left me no peace. There was an unnatural confidence in his body, in every movement, as if he was always one step ahead of me, as if he knew everything that would happen to me. At some point, I began to notice that they were both becoming strangely persistent. Derek, despite all his charm, somehow always seemed to be there when I felt especially uneasy. He didn't say anything specific, but his looks and touches made me feel like he was in control, like everything was going according to his plan. And Roger, that boy with the old man's eyes, watched me so closely that I began to feel his presence even in the most secluded corners of the orphanage. Often I would wake up in the middle of the night and find myself unable to rest, unable to close my eyes, unable to stop thinking. I was haunted by questions. What was wrong with these children? Why were they here, in this place? What was really going on in this orphanage? I could no longer believe a word they said. And all this tension, this fear, this sense of inevitability, it all squeezed my chest. I was afraid that one day I would wake up and would no longer be able to escape this nightmare. And just when I was starting to lose hope, when it seemed to me that all this was just a game in which I was a pawn, I got lucky again. One night, when I couldn't sleep, I noticed that down below, in the deepest corner of the basement, the light was on again. It was the same light I had seen before. I decided that this time I wouldn't hesitate. All I had to do was get through that basement. There in that dark corner was some answer I was looking for. As I walked down, I felt the same chill that I had felt when I first came to this place. But this time, I was ready. I was ready to see the truth, no matter how terrible it was. I walked down the empty hallway and finally reached a door with a light on. I opened it, and before me was a scene that made my blood run cold. It was not what I expected to see. On the floor, in the center of the room, lay two bodies, a dead woman and a man who looked dead, but his body was so twisted that it seemed like it had burst. The scene filled me with such horror that I couldn't even breathe. I stood there, unable to believe what was happening. But that wasn't all. When I looked back, my gaze fell on a small creature. It was the boy I had seen before, Roger, or as he called himself, Ben. But now he was not quite alive. His skin was pale and his eyes were glassy. He stood there, leaning against the wall, like an old man in a child's body. I couldn't take my eyes off him. That horror, that terrifying image, it settled in my thoughts and didn't want to go away. "What are you?" I asked, but my voice froze in my throat. I didn't know what to expect. But his answer was something I couldn't understand. He said he was Ben, that he was reborn. The words stirred up such chaos in my head that I could barely connect the dots. The Ben who wasn't. The Ben who had become someone else. I remembered Derek's words, his cryptic hints, and suddenly I knew I was at the center of something much bigger than I could have imagined. I gasped in fear. I heard footsteps behind me and turned around. It was Derek. He walked into the basement, his face expressionless. He looked at me and took a step forward. "You know too much," he said, and I felt his words pierce my very soul. I backed away, trying to find a way out, but everything around me was locked. Suddenly I realized that I could no longer turn around and leave. I was a part of this, and maybe it wasn't just an accident. I couldn't let this situation go unscathed. Either way, they weren't going to let me go. Story 6. The thumping woke me. It was a familiar, almost inevitable sound, like when my son Ben kicks the wall of his bedroom in his sleep. It becomes more obvious every day. Ben sleeps with no boundaries, if not the wall, then his toys, and if not the toys, then my feet, dragging his nightly fights right into our bed. But this night was different. I knew it wasn't just his usual tossing and turning. I lay in the darkness, feeling the weight of sleep that had not yet fully overtaken me. My body was already alert, but my mind was just beginning to come to its senses. The knocking continued, strong and regular, as if its own inner world was deciding that the walls of its room were too soft to remain safe. It was not just a knock, it was a challenge. There was no room for simple anxiety. The knocking seemed more important than the simple tossing and turning of sleep. I didn't move. For a long time, I just lay there, listening to the sound, until I heard it. Mum was tired, that was obvious. She had been working in the UK for the last week, and in fact the entire week had passed at a pace where I was alone with the children, with their needs and problems. Now she was back home, but her body and mind had not yet had time to adjust after such intense days. She needed rest, and I knew that if I didn't take care of Ben, this night would turn into an endless series of blows to the back of the head and knees to the stomach. I struggled out of bed and didn't open my eyes. I just lay there in the dark, feeling my fingers curl into fists and my joints creak with indistinct movements. I didn't want to see anything. Only when my hands found the chest of drawers did I crack open my left eyelid. The clock showed 3:06. Time had sharpened my awareness, and I felt it deafening me. 3 o'clock in the morning. It wasn't unusual for me. Too many nights I'd been up at this hour, trying to figure out where my life was, where I was. But now it all seemed worse than before. I stood up, groping around on the floor, trying to find my pajamas, trying to find some kind of reference point in this darkness. I trudged into the hallway, keeping my eyes closed, listening to the sounds filling the house beyond the walls. Whispers that could have just been part of a nighttime fantasy, or maybe sounds I heard because my brain wouldn't let me go into the real world. I thought Kay was still asleep, but nothing was clear. My vision was blurry and my thoughts weren't forming a clear picture. I walked down the hallway, trying to figure out what was going on, trying not to think about how exactly I ended up in this vicious circle of nighttime problems. Ben's door was open, and the whispers coming from his bedroom sounded like something inarticulate. It was like gibberish. I knew he was calling for my mother, but now, in the stillness of the night, his words sounded garbled, like someone was just trying to talk without realizing what was coming out of their mouth. He called again and again. "Mom!" His voice penetrated every cell of my body, making everything inside me clench. But there was no usual note of anxiety in it. It was a cry I had heard many times before, but now I did not want to react as usual. This was something different, something more than just dissatisfaction with sleep. "Ben, you need to calm down," I thought. I knew he needed to feel his mom's presence, but at that moment, I couldn't help but think that something was wrong. I walked into his room and saw him sitting on his bed wearing his pajama suit, which he always loved so much, as if it were a shield against the terrors of the night. I stood in front of him and looked at him. His eyes were wide open, and yet it did not look like he was really awake. He was there, but his eyes were empty, as if he was not with us. I had to know what exactly had happened, but I had this strange feeling that something was wrong. But I was too tired to delve into my feelings. All I wanted was to get this night back on track, to bring back calm and normalcy, and not let this night be the beginning of something I couldn't understand. But, as always, nothing happened the way I wanted. The thumping woke me. It was a familiar, almost inevitable sound, like when my son, Ben, kicks the wall of his bedroom in his sleep. It becomes more obvious every day. Ben sleeps with no boundaries, if not the wall, then his toys, and if not the toys, then my feet, dragging his nightly fights right into our bed. But this night was different. I knew it wasn't just his usual tossing and turning. I lay in the darkness, feeling the weight of sleep that had not yet fully overtaken me. My body was already alert, but my mind was just beginning to come to its senses. The knocking continued, strong and regular, as if its own inner world was deciding that the walls of its room were too soft to remain safe. It was not just a knock, it was a challenge. There was no room for simple anxiety. The knocking seemed more important than the simple tossing and turning of sleep. I didn't move. For a long time I just lay there, listening to the sound, until I heard it. A thin, squeaky voice, piercing the silence of the night. "Mom!" It sounded strange. I knew right away it was Ben, but something in his voice made me wary. Mom was tired, that was obvious. She had been working in the UK for the last week, and in fact the entire week had passed at a pace where I was alone with the children, with their needs and problems. Now she was back home, but her body and mind had not yet had time to adjust after such intense days. She needed rest, and I knew that if I didn't take care of Ben, this night would turn into an endless series of blows to the back of the head and knees to the stomach. I struggled out of bed and didn't open my eyes. I just lay there in the dark, feeling my fingers curl into fists and my joints creak with indistinct movements. I didn't want to see anything. Only when my hands found the chest of drawers did I crack open my left eyelid. The clock showed 3:06. Time had sharpened my awareness, and I felt it deafening me. 3 o'clock in the morning. It wasn't unusual for me. Too many nights I'd been up at this hour, trying to figure out where my life was, where I was. But now, it all seemed worse than before. I stood up, groping around on the floor, trying to find my pajamas, trying to find some kind of reference point in this darkness. I trudged into the hallway, keeping my eyes closed, listening to the sounds filling the house beyond the walls. Whispers that could have just been part of a nighttime fantasy, or maybe sounds I heard because my brain wouldn't let me go into the real world. I thought Kay was still asleep, but nothing was clear. My vision was blurry, and my thoughts weren't forming a clear picture. I walked down the hallway, trying to figure out what was going on, trying not to think about how exactly I ended up in this vicious circle of nighttime problems. Ben's door was open, and the whispers coming from his bedroom sounded like something inarticulate. It was like gibberish. I knew he was calling for my mother, but now, in the stillness of the night, his words sounded garbled, like someone was just trying to talk without realizing what was coming out of their mouth. He called again, and again. "Mom!" His voice penetrated every cell of my body, making everything inside me clench, but there was no usual note of anxiety in it. It was a cry I had heard many times before, but now I did not want to react as usual. This was something different, something more than just dissatisfaction with sleep. "Ben, you need to calm down," I thought. I knew he needed to feel his mom's presence, but at that moment, I couldn't help but think that something was wrong. I walked into his room and saw him sitting on his bed, wearing his pajama suit, which he always loved so much, as if it were a shield against the terrors of the night. I stood in front of him and looked at him. His eyes were wide open, and yet it did not look like he was really awake. He was there, but his eyes were empty, as if he was not with us. I didn't know what exactly had happened, but I had this strange feeling that something was wrong, but I was too tired to delve into my feelings. All I wanted was to get this night back on track, to bring back calm and normalcy, and not let this night be the beginning of something I couldn't understand. I stood in the hallway, hearing Ben calling for his mother again, but now his voice sounded not only tired but also oddly panicked. I glanced back at Kay, but she was still asleep. Once we had agreed I was supposed to take over the nightly duties so she could get some sleep, and so every time she returned from a trip or work, I took over as night guard. But now, as I stood there in the hallway, that role seemed less simple. I moved toward Ben's door. It was ajar, and the soft light from his room played on the walls. I could hear his small footsteps moving around the room. Holding my nighttime slumber in my arms, I tried to feel my way back to normal again. My hand rested on the door frame, and I slid inside. The room was still, but thickly silent. Ben sat on the edge of the bed, his gaze unmoving, his face frozen. He stared at one point, motionless, like a statue. But his eyes, something was wrong. I knew his face, I knew his eyes. They always reflected happiness or worry, but now there was nothing in them. "Ben?" I wasn't sure I said it out loud, but his body responded. He jerked slightly and turned toward me. I felt his eyes focus on me. He didn't say anything, didn't move. He just watched as I opened my mouth slightly, trying to figure out what was going on. "Do you want something?" I asked, my voice sounding impotently urgent. I tried to pull him out of this unnatural confusion, but he didn't answer. Instead, his fingers began to move, reaching for the edge of the bed, and I couldn't help but notice how his small hands were clenching nervously, as if he was losing something, trying to figure out what was happening. He looked at me, and then looked back at something invisible in the corner of the room. "I want my mother," he said, but it didn't sound like his usual demand anymore. It sounded like some kind of restless echo, like something frozen in the shadows of the night. I couldn't figure out what was wrong. He was in his room, in his bed, and in those moments when I tried to calm him down, he always said the same thing. But here, something was wrong. I sat down next to him on the bed. My knees creaked and I felt a sharp pain in the joint, but I didn't pay attention to it. Concentrating on him, I asked again, "You want water?" I tried to snap him out of his restlessness, but his eyes were fixed on me, unblinking, and his gaze was becoming more and more distant. He shook his head. There was no fear in his answer, no despair, not even irritation. There was something strange, unnatural. "It's not Mom," he said, and it came out of him like a cold confession that made me shudder. I froze, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. He seemed absolutely certain of it, and suddenly I felt uneasy. I couldn't figure out what was happening, but the feeling that something was wrong clenched inside me. I tried to look into his eyes, but their deep emptiness and invisible tension confused me. All these days I was in constant tension, but this night seemed different. I did not know what to do, and why this strange feeling was taking hold of me. "Ben," I didn't know how to finish the sentence. Instead, I just sat next to him, looking at his frozen figure. There was still silence outside the room, and I suddenly felt this silence become more oppressive, as if it were consuming me, my thoughts and my feelings. I looked at the door. Kay still hadn't come out. There was no way she hadn't woken up from all this weirdness. But why hadn't she come here and asked what was going on? Suddenly, something flashed in the hallway and I tensed, feeling my heart beat faster. It was something so unnatural that I felt my mind begin to blur. Before I could fully comprehend what was happening, a strange uneasiness came over me. I stood up, lifting Ben into my arms. He didn't resist, but his body remained tense and still. "Mom," he repeated, more quietly now, almost in a whisper. But there was none of the usual warmth in his voice, only an emptiness that frightened me even more. I turned, heading down the hallway, and suddenly noticed that the shadows around me had become different, deeper. My body was shaking, and I finally realized that I couldn't understand what was happening. All my nighttime fears, my worries and anxieties had merged into one single reality. The strangeness of what was happening didn't leave me, but I knew that I had to keep moving forward. Just as I always moved through the night, through its worries and little horrors, but now it was real. I held Ben in my arms and led him toward our bedroom, but the feeling of unease didn't leave me. Suddenly something moved in the hallway again, and I froze. My thoughts returned to Kay. Why wasn't she here? The corridor seemed long and unnaturally silent. Every movement I made echoed in the empty shadows. I walked carefully, trying to understand what was happening, trying to find an explanation for it all. But the further I went, the more I felt the pressure in my chest grow. The silence wasn't just silence, it was wary, as if the night itself was watching my every step. At that moment, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Ben still didn't respond. He was sitting in my arms, his small hands clasped around my shoulder, but his eyes were clouded, as if he were no longer here in this moment. There was a sort of sleepy confusion on his face, and although his body was close, his soul seemed to be elsewhere. I tried to comfort him, although I didn't know what to say. He was not the same as I knew. This child, always so alive, now looked like a ghost, and it haunted me. I walked down the hallway, barely feeling the floor beneath my feet. The shadows on the sides seemed denser, darker, and it seemed like they were starting to move behind me. I quickened my pace, but suddenly something strange made me stop. My gaze automatically slid toward our bedroom door. It was slightly open, but not all the way, as if someone had left it that way on purpose, not closing it completely. It was strange, because Kay usually always closed the door all the way, even if she returned from night walks around the house. I kept walking, and the closer I got to the bedroom, the more I felt like I wasn't alone in the house, and neither was Kay. I felt a presence moving behind us, following us, but something about that presence felt unnatural. My gaze fell on Ben again. He still hadn't moved, but his eyes now seemed completely empty, as if he were in a trance. I knew I couldn't wait any longer. I quickly entered the bedroom, trying to believe that I would find everything as usual. But everything was different. The room was too quiet, and a strange smell hung in the air, the same as I smelled in the hallway, as if something damp, rotting, something alien and dead was here. I looked around. Kay was not there. My hand slid along the wall in search of light, and finally I turned on the lamp. The light couldn't dispel the darkness that filled the room. I felt something cold tightening in my chest, and a sense of desperate uncertainty washed over me. I walked over to the bed and lowered Ben onto the edge, but as soon as his body touched the blanket, I knew something was wrong. The blanket was wet. No, not just wet, it was soaked with something sticky and dark, as if something that shouldn't be in this house had left its mark. My hand automatically reached for the phone on the nightstand, but then I froze. The sound I heard was too quiet to be normal. It was barely audible. It was coming from a corner of the room where there was no possible source of the sound. My heart started beating faster, and I turned around. The shadow there was different. It wasn't just moving. It was changing shape, as if something in this room was trying to become something it wasn't supposed to be. "Kay," I whispered, although I probably already knew that she was not in the room. Everything around me was becoming so strange and alien that I began to doubt the reality of what was happening. The shadow moved again, and I felt something inside me snap. I moved toward the door, hoping that maybe all I was feeling was just fatigue, that I just didn't understand what was happening. But as soon as I raised my hand to the handle, a figure appeared in front of me. It wasn't quite human, but I couldn't quite figure out what it was. The figure's face was blurry, like fog, and its outline wasn't clear either. However, I could clearly see its eyes looking straight at me, full of a frightening, cold indifference. Everything inside me froze. It was something alien, alien even to the very essence of humanity. I took a step back, trying to contain the panic that was rising in my chest, but the figure did not move, only stood and watched. Then, with a cold rustle, it walked toward Ben. My body froze. I couldn't understand what was happening, but I knew one thing. This couldn't be normal. I grabbed Ben and yanked him off the bed, not thinking, not realizing. But when I lifted him up, I realized that this wasn't just a nighttime anxiety anymore. This was something else entirely. Something far more sinister. "No!" I cried, feeling my arm tighten around his body. The figure vanished as quickly as it had appeared, but its presence remained. I couldn't believe what I had just experienced. I jerked back, pulling Ben toward the door, toward the light, hoping that this was all just a nightmare. It all happened so fast that I didn't even have time to understand what exactly made me act so hastily. I couldn't hold Ben in my arms. I couldn't stand here. Everything inside me screamed at me to run out of this room, out of this house where something was wrong, where something was breaking into our reality, destroying it. I ran out of the room, clutching my son in my arms, his small body almost unconscious, as if unaware of what was happening. I ran into the hallway, glancing at the empty space around me. At first it seemed that nothing had changed. Everything was as usual. But it was a false calm that I could no longer afford. I almost ran to the nursery. Kay and I always made sure May didn't feel unprotected, so her room was always bright and quiet. It was her sanctuary. But when I opened the door, I smelled it again, that smell I couldn't forget, the smell of decay and mustiness. I clenched my teeth, trying to figure out what had happened. There was a strange heaviness in the air, as if all the good memories of home had evaporated, leaving only emptiness. May sat on the bed, her gaze unnaturally cold and detached. She sat motionless, as if her body was here but her soul had already gone somewhere far away, beyond the confines of this room. I stood in the doorway and froze. Something was wrong. She didn't look scared. She didn't look worried. She looked like stone, emotionless, lifeless. May, I whispered her name, not knowing what else to say. The name didn't sound the same anymore. It was empty. There was no light in her eyes. I didn't know how to bring her back. I didn't know how to bring back this girl I knew like my own soul. All I could do was look at her in horror, not knowing what to do. And that's when I realized this night wasn't over. And maybe it hadn't even begun. I stepped into her room and sat down next to her. May didn't react. I tried calling her again, but she just looked at me, and there was nothing alive in her gaze. It was a gaze I didn't know, that I didn't understand. She wasn't here. She was somewhere far away, gone somewhere. Ben, still confused, began to snore softly in my arms. I placed him next to my daughter, trying to connect their presences to each other, hoping that would help. But May continued to look at me, and her eyes expressed nothing. There was no fear, no anxiety, only emptiness. I stood up and walked into the hallway, feeling that strange heaviness in the air again, as if the walls of the house were closing in. I tried not to think about what had just happened in the bedroom, not to think about the figure that had disappeared, not to think about how everything was wrong. But I couldn't help but think. I heard footsteps behind me, walking in my direction. The sounds were quiet, but distinct. Something was following me. Something old and invisible. Something that didn't belong in this house. I stopped at the door of our bedroom. I already knew that Kay couldn't be there. She couldn't be in the room because I had just seen her leave. But when I opened the door, I froze, unsure of what to do. There was someone in the room. It couldn't be Kay. It was something else. I didn't know what. I stood there, feeling a wave of terror wash over me, a wave that seemed to tear at my mind. I couldn't breathe, and I couldn't move. Everything in the room went gray, as if the air was thickening, filling with something old, something restless. I felt a chill creep into my bones, and a figure appeared before me. It stood in a dark corner, its outline blurred, as if it were part of the shadow itself. It did not move, but the sense of its presence was unbearably strong. The dark figure looked at me, and I felt something inside me break. I had to leave. I had to take the children and run. I couldn't stay here. This place was cursed. But I couldn't move. When I finally took a step, the figure seemed to disappear. I turned around instantly, in a panic, but it was already far away outside the room. It was so fast that I didn't even have time to realize what had happened. But I understood one thing. We were not alone here, and if we stayed, this something would haunt us, would take us all. I didn't know where to go. I didn't know what to do. Everything was spinning in my head, and before my eyes there was only one single question: how to get out of this house. I picked up Ben and May, along with Harley, our dog, and ran out into the hallway. I couldn't stay here any longer. We had to go, and the sooner the better. With this feeling, we ran out into the street without stopping. We didn't know what awaited us, but I felt that the house was left behind, and we were not supposed to return. We drove through the empty night, heading for the light, heading for a place where it seemed that whatever was following us couldn't be. The road was foggy, and the world outside the window seemed so alien that I felt like something that hadn't let us go was still following us. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't the only ones moving through the night. May sat in the back seat, huddled next to the dog. There was still nothing in her eyes but emptiness. I didn't know what to make of it. She didn't speak, didn't ask. She just sat there, silent, as if her body was here, but her soul was somewhere else. I tried not to look at her, not to try to find an answer in her silence. Ben, on the other hand, was lost in his thoughts. His small hands were clutching the toy I had placed next to him, but his gaze was strangely fixed. I felt like he was older than he actually was, Something about his expression reminded me of a man who had been through more than he should have. He couldn't understand what had happened, but he knew something was wrong. I held the wheel, not knowing where to go. Only fragments of thoughts were spinning in my head. We have to leave. We can't go back. They can't find us. They've already found us. But how long could we drive like this? Where would we be? What night could we book a place for? Could we even find shelter if there was already something on us that was bothering us? I glanced at Kay. She was sitting next to me, clutching her seat, her face pale and her hands shaking. She couldn't believe this was real either. She wasn't just worried, she was broken, and I could see it in her eyes. She couldn't afford to panic, because she was our rock, but I knew something terrible was happening inside her. "Are you sure we did the right thing?" Her voice was barely audible, like a whisper, swallowed up by the noise of the night road. I was silent. The words wouldn't come. What could I tell her? That we had fled our home because it wasn't just a threat. There were shadows living among us, in us. We were trying to hide, but could we? Were we running away from something that wouldn't let us go? My eyes looked ahead, but all I saw was darkness. The darkness that surrounded us. And I couldn't figure out what was haunting us. Was it really something supernatural? Or was it our psyche, broken by stress, tired of the misfortune we had endured? I looked at Kay. She was withdrawn. It seemed like she still didn't believe what had happened. She was thinking too much, and I couldn't even collect my thoughts. All I wanted was to somehow calm her down. But the words wouldn't come, and all my efforts seemed empty. Suddenly I noticed her close her eyes and take a deep breath, as if trying to get out of what was tormenting her. Her face was shaking, and it was not from the cold, but from fear. At this point, Ben spoke quietly. "What was that, Dad?" He raised his head and looked at me with his big eyes full of bewilderment. I didn't know what to say. How do you explain to a small child that they may have encountered something that can't be explained in words? How do you tell them that we left because the house we once lived in had become a place where fear awaited us? I turned off the engine, standing on the side of the road. There was nothing around, only fog and uncertainty. The lighthouse we were looking for was now far away, and we did not know where to go next. I felt something cold touch my heart. In the silence of the night, I suddenly realized that perhaps we could never go home. We could not return to a place where shadows, like living creatures, crossed the border between reality and nightmares. We drove on, not knowing what was ahead. Where would we be in an hour, in 2? We were looking for safety, but what if there was no place where we could be safe from what we had seen and felt in our home? But despite all the doubt and fear, I knew one thing. We were together. And as long as we held on to each other, even with this new terror stalking us, we could handle anything. In search of light, in search of answers to questions no one could give us, we moved forward. Because maybe only in movement could we find our salvation. Story 7. Moving to a new apartment was not a decision I made right away. There are always moments in life when you have to choose between taking a step into the unknown or staying in a familiar but unsatisfied reality. My old apartment was no longer my home. The rent was too expensive, the location was inconvenient, the area was noisy, and I didn't have any peace, even at night. Every month, I worried about how the rent would go up and my savings would melt away. I never got used to the fact that I could lose everything I had saved because of some meaningless arithmetic. Dreams of stability and peace seemed unrealistic. At some point, I realized that it was time to change something. I was ready to end this endless cycle I was living in and start over. One rainy day, I saw an advert for an apartment for rent. It seemed like nothing special, just another room, but something in me made me choose this option. I called the agent and without thinking arranged a meeting. He turned out to be a wiry man with a clipped voice and carefully polished boots that, when he walked across the old rustic floor, clattered loudly like a warning. Unexpectedly, for myself, I have arrived. As soon as he opened the door to the apartment, I felt that this was the place for me. The building was old, but that was what gave it a certain appeal. Everything was a little scratched by time, with a musty smell in the hallway that was really just the smell of old mold. But when he pushed the door open, I saw sunlight pouring through the large window and illuminating the floor. I immediately noticed the huge mountains that stretched along the horizon, a menacing but majestic promise. Here, beyond that window, in that misty, illuminated space, I sensed something more important than just a change of scenery. I didn't plan to stay here for long, but the rent was so attractive that even this moment did not cause me the slightest doubt. I signed the contract, and feeling that I had made the right choice, I decided to start a new stage of my life. The first few days in the new apartment were something of a truce. It was quiet and calm. My usual day, so familiar and measured. In the morning I went to work, feeling the freshness of the cold air on my cheeks when I turned the key in the lock. In the evening, returning home, I got my portion of silence that filled the empty apartment, where I had not yet gotten around to installing my personal belongings. The rooms were still empty, everything was in its place, only something invisible and undefined hung in the air, as if some kind of premonition awaited me, but I did not know what exactly. The locals often glanced at me as I walked down the corridor. They were silent, as if they were not used to the new residence, or perhaps they simply did not want to explain anything to me. Everything was so ordinary that I could not imagine that anything could change the course of my days. Everything was fine until that night. I came home from work and, as usual, let myself into the empty apartment. The light was pouring through the window, reflecting its last rays, and I felt how everything was starting to calm down. I still hadn't reached the point where I would actually start to arrange the apartment. Everything remained in the same neutral state, and I decided that everything would be calm for a couple more weeks. But it wasn't. I couldn't explain what had changed, but everything was different that night. At first, they were just nightmares. The usual night terrors, I thought, that I'd been experiencing for the past few days. But they weren't just dreams. They were strange, unclear visions that appeared at the most unpredictable moments. They pierced me, as if someone was piercing my consciousness and leaving traces of something I couldn't understand. It wasn't just fear, it was more. I would wake up in a cold sweat, my eyes scanning the empty darkness. The walls seemed to shift around me, and my pulse was beating so fast I couldn't calm down. I felt like something invisible was moving around the room, watching me, but I didn't know what. And then, one night, it started. The doorbell rang, sharp, piercing the night. It was midnight. Precisely, as if on schedule. At first I didn't pay attention. Maybe it was one of the neighbors, maybe the kids running around the floor. But the next morning, I felt how each day was becoming more intense. The calls didn't stop. That night I decided I had to find out what was going on. I waited, sat in the dark, staring at the door. My phone cast a dim light in my hand. I heard it ring when the clock hands pointed to exactly 12, and in that moment, everything changed. I stood up, overcome by some inexplicable tension, and walked to the door. Putting my eye to the peephole, I froze, and I saw it. An eye. It was black as an abyss, no pupil, no iris, just emptiness, as if the gaze itself was absorbing all that was luminous around it. The eye was so close that I felt its presence pierce me. Fear gripped me, and I jumped back, hitting the door. But that eye continued to stare. It didn't blink, it just stared. That night, I sat in the shadows, holding my phone in my hands, but I couldn't think of anything. My thoughts were disorganized, like pieces of lost memories that couldn't fit together into a clear picture. I tried to explain to myself that this couldn't be real. This was just my fantasy, my worries, my fears that had burst out to fill the dark corners of the apartment. But I knew it wasn't a dream. What I saw through the peephole was real. He was there, and that feeling of his presence never left me. Even when I rose from the floor, when I regained control of my body, I felt something had changed. That look wouldn't go away. It was around every corner, in every mirror, in every rustle behind the door. I didn't know what he wanted, but it didn't matter. He was here. When morning came, I was exhausted, as if I had not slept all night. The shadows that filled my dreams did not leave me. I was exhausted beyond measure. Fear and anxiety. It was as if they had eaten me up overnight, leaving only a shell. I dressed quickly and headed to work, trying to get away from it all. I knew it was not a solution, but at the time it was the only way out. The day passed slowly. When I entered the office, it seemed to me that the space around me had become somehow alien, and even the usual people had become unfamiliar to me. I felt like an unnatural part of this world. The workday dragged on, and I basically couldn't concentrate on the tasks that were assigned to me. My gaze constantly darted around the room, returning to the doors, looking for something that could calm me down, and there was nothing. Only a cold silence in which the footsteps of other employees and the rustle of papers sounded. My inner world was consumed by only one thing, that emptiness in the peephole of the door that haunted me. Returning home brought no relief. I couldn't shake the feeling its presence had become constant, like a shadow watching my every move. I locked the door as usual and tried to distract myself by turning on the TV. The noise it made was supposed to help me forget. However, as soon as the screen came to life, I felt a strange tension in the air. The familiar light of the TV didn't create a sense of comfort. It only added to my anxiety. Static soon clouded the screen, and I felt the fear thicken in the air. The eye, that same black void I saw again, only now it was on the screen. I couldn't look away. Everything was unnaturally slow again. My eyes couldn't believe what they were seeing. That gaze that had been so alive, it came alive, it looked at me through the screen, through all the barriers. I felt something dark sucking me into itself again. My fingers were shaking, and I let go of the fork without realizing it. The fork clattered to the floor, and I staggered away from the TV as if that gaze could swallow me whole. I stood there, trying to figure out what was happening. My head was spinning, my thoughts were a mess. A feeling of unbearable terror was tearing through me. I knew I couldn't just sit there and watch. But I couldn't do anything. I was powerless. The silence of the night enveloped me again. But now it was not just silence. It was something cold, unnatural, frightening. I rose from my place, feeling how every movement became difficult. My legs did not obey me, and I went to the bedroom to escape this nightmare at least a little. It was impossible to fall asleep. My eyes would not close. They were constantly drilling space, and in every shadow I expected to see him again. At every moment it seemed to me that any minute now, somewhere nearby, this gaze would look into me again. This feeling was so real that I did not know where to hide from it. My eyelids trembled, creating a strange rhythm that I could not control. When I woke up the next morning, I felt as if I had not slept at all. Every movement, every breath seemed unreal. I did not know how to cope with it, but I knew one thing. This darkness, this emptiness, it would not leave me. Everything was swallowed up, and nothing could protect me from what I now saw everywhere. Every night, every minute, it seemed to me that I would again and again encounter this gaze, and I didn't know why. What did it mean? What did he want from me? Why couldn't I just forget about it? My life was filled with this fear, and every morning when I woke up, I knew he would still be there. He would watch me, wait for me to dare approach the door again. He would watch through the peephole. He would watch through the TV. He would be there, and I wouldn't be able to stop him. The fear became a part of me, and that feeling wouldn't leave me. He was there. My body felt heavy, and my mind even more confused. It was as if I was in some kind of dead end, in a circle from which I could not escape. It seemed to me that this was all part of some nightmare that could not end. But every morning when I woke up, it was exactly the same as the previous one. Too real. I could no longer sit quietly in the apartment. Even simple sounds, rustling, footsteps in the hallway, slight vibrations of the door handle, all this was perceived as a harbinger of something inevitable, as if someone or something was watching me, and I could not understand why it was choosing me. Every movement, every glance towards the door brought a wave of horror, and I did not know where to go, where to hide, run, where. That look could not be just an illusion. With each passing day, I began to notice that I couldn't shake this feeling. It was as if someone had filled the space around me, making me feel like I wasn't alone. I would sit in the kitchen and look out the window, watching people pass by, but they seemed so distant, so alien. My life wasn't the same anymore. I didn't know what was scaring me, the look through the peephole or the fact that I could now be part of something much scarier. I stopped turning on the TV in the evenings. It no longer provided the sensation of noise that could somehow drown out this inner fear. I could no longer sit in the dark. The flashes of static electricity no longer gave me peace. On the contrary, they made me feel trapped, with no way out. Fear was becoming a part of me. It was permeating every thought, every movement, every day. I couldn't just walk around the apartment anymore. I slowed down, always feeling like someone was watching me. When I passed a door, I couldn't help but feel its presence. as if it was there, behind the door, and I had to go back to see it again. That look, those red eyelids, it all stayed with me, like a repetition of some inevitable event. I tried to figure out what was happening to me. Why only me? Why did this look appear on me? I couldn't concentrate at work either. My thoughts kept returning to what I had seen. What was that? What should I do? One evening when I returned home, I felt the air in the apartment become unusually thick. Everything inside was as usual. Empty walls, old furniture that did not yet feel like a part of this apartment. But something was wrong. My gaze automatically dropped to the peephole, and then I noticed it was a little dimmer than before. My heart began to pound, and I couldn't help myself. I moved closer. I put my eye to the peephole, expecting to see him, the same abyss I'd seen before. But this time there was nothing, just a dark void, as if he'd pulled away, as if something was missing. I stood there by the door, my fingers hovering for a moment, pressing against the metal. It was like a premonition, like a realization that this was the moment when I was supposed to understand something. And then, as if the universe had suddenly decided to show me the truth, I noticed something strange. In the shadow of the peephole, in the darkness at the other end of the corridor, I made out something. It was a blurry movement, something that quickly disappeared, barely having time to appear. My heart crashed into my ribcage, my breath caught in my throat. It was him. He was there again. Or something else. I recoiled, my head spinning. That moment, trying to figure out what I had just seen, felt like an eternity. I stood there, hunched over with fear, feeling his shadow watching me. What did it mean? Why did I feel like someone had been waiting for this moment again? Unable to resist, I went back to the door, but now I couldn't go to the peephole again. I stood there, cold sweat breaking out. Something inside me was trying to resist. I didn't know what to do. And that emptiness, that darkness behind the door, was becoming more and more real. I could feel it, as if it were more than just darkness. I didn't understand why this was happening to me, but I knew one thing. I needed to understand. I needed to take back control, and to do that I needed to know what was behind that door. What was waiting for me there in that hallway, in those looks I couldn't understand. I knew I couldn't live peacefully until I saw what was hidden behind this emptiness. But now, as I rose again to take another step, my fear was so strong that I didn't even know if I could do it. Chills, cold certainty. I was not alone. The appearance of that gaze, that alien, frightening eye, was just the beginning. Once I admitted that fear to myself, it took hold of me. I couldn't stop thinking about it. It haunted me, slipping into my thoughts when I tried to work, eat, or even just look out the window. And every time I tried to shake the image away, it became more real. After a few days, I began to notice changes in my apartment. At first, they were subtle details. One of the light bulbs began to flicker, creating strange shadows on the walls. And then the temperature in the room itself seemed to change. The air became colder, although the heating worked as usual. I began to often feel like someone was touching me from the inside, not physically, but somehow deeper, in the very fabric of reality. One day, as I stood by the window, looking out over the city, watching its everyday bustle, I suddenly realized that the whole world around me had changed. It was blurry, as if I were looking through glass, but without clarity, without precision. Sounds became muffled, and I increasingly felt as if I were outside of time. My own steps, my movements, all seemed slow, alien, and distorted. All week I couldn't shake this feeling that something was watching me, something that shouldn't be here, but it could all just be the result of my fear, my endless thinking. I tried to convince myself of this, told myself it was just nervous tension, but every morning when I opened my eyes, I discovered that there was nothing normal in the world. It was becoming more and more alien. I couldn't stay in the apartment any longer. I tried to go outside, tried to find refuge in ordinary life, but as soon as I returned, the sensations were distorted again. Sometimes it seemed to me that someone had crossed the boundaries of this apartment and was now following me throughout the entire house. I saw it in reflections, in puddles of water, even in the transparent screens of phones. This gaze, this bottomless shadow followed me. It was not just an eye, but an entire being, alive, absorbed in me, in my walls, in this apartment, in this city. Every night I was on guard. Every time I went to bed I felt it. And although I knew that nothing could be, that all my experiences were just a game of my mind, I could not get rid of the feeling that something was close. Something was very close, and it was not going to go away. But one night, when I heard the familiar doorbell ring again, and I couldn't decide whether it was really happening or just in my mind, I realized I couldn't stand it anymore. I decided that I had to return to this view, to the source. I couldn't live in this endless waiting, being haunted by something I couldn't understand. And even if it was the last thing I did, I had to find out what was behind this emptiness. I walked up to the door again. My fingers felt the cold metal of the peephole, and I knew this moment was inevitable. I pressed myself against it again, hoping to see that same look, that same black eye that swallowed the light and made me shake with fear, but something was wrong. This time was different. Now, I didn't just see emptiness. I saw movement, shadows, flickering, as if someone was moving at the other end. Something was moving, but it was too fast to tell what it was. It was vague, like something that lurked beyond the boundaries of my perception. But at the same time, I felt that it was alive, with consciousness, with intent. I pulled back, shaking. That look was no longer empty. It was becoming something active, alive. Not just a look, it was like an observation that was hungry for something from me. I could feel it. I could sense it entering me, becoming a part of it, beginning to dissolve into me. I couldn't stay here any longer. It wasn't just fear. It was a hunger for that look. I couldn't avoid what I was seeing any longer. What was it? Who was it? The answers remained hidden, but I knew one thing. Whatever it was, it made me want to know more. My body couldn't stand in this place any longer, as if it was a link connecting me to something much darker and more terrible. And just as I was about to move away from the door, I felt something touch me, a cold touch, like a shadow sliding across my skin. I flinched, but when I looked back, I saw nothing, only emptiness, but I knew she was there, and now I had no choice. I had to find out. There was almost nothing left to go back to. The fear I felt was not just ordinary anxiety. It was much deeper. It pulled me like a magnet, as if I was part of something that was overwhelming me, that was capturing me, threatening to swallow me up. I felt the boundary between reality and what was happening in my head gradually disappear. Every morning I woke up and immediately felt that this world I lived in did not belong to me. I was just an observer, out of control. Night came again and again, the same familiar call. It was harsh, precise, as if time was its master and I was only its prisoner. Every time I tried to ignore it, it seemed as if my fear was sharpening, squeezing my insides, forcing me to go towards what I did not want. But I could not stop. I walked back to the door. My fingers were shaking, but I couldn't let myself go. The peephole was cold, its metal surface damp with the night's humidity, and I could feel my breath on it. This was where it all began, and I knew I couldn't escape it. My body tensed as I pressed my face against the peephole again. In that moment, I knew that this time would be different. I felt the silence around me grow thick, as if the sounds had disappeared, leaving only me and that eye. It was no longer just a void. I saw its contours blur, distort, like dark shadows that intertwined, carrying movement, an animal instinct, a hunger for something alive. And then I understood. He was alive. It wasn't just a look. It was something more, something that knew how to observe, knew how to see me in these narrow spaces of my life. It didn't just wait. It calculated. I stepped back from the door, as if something inside me told me that I was too close to back out now, but stepping back wouldn't help me. I could still feel that presence, that gaze, that absorbing attention, its ability to penetrate my soul like a fine needle into flesh. It knew I was afraid, and that was what made me not let go. My head was buzzing. I squeezed my eyes shut again and tried to focus. My steps were heavy. The world was falling apart like a mosaic from which several pieces had been torn out. The gaze, there it was again. But there was something different about it now. It began to move, as if trying to climb through the lens of the peephole. Its forms became indistinct. unsteady, but fear was visible in them. My heart was pounding in my chest, my blood was shaking my body, like when you're in a fever and you feel like you're about to lose consciousness. But I had to watch. I had to know. I pressed my eye to the peephole again, my eyes sliding over the dark surface, trying to catch just one moment, 1 second to understand what it really was. The silence was so thick it seemed painful. Time slowed down, as if space itself was trying to tell me that I was approaching something I shouldn't be seeing. That was when I saw it. Not just the eye, but everything. It wasn't just a thing, but a dark mass that was starting to grow, sucking all the life out of me. I felt my gaze begin to lose focus, my mind unable to focus on what was happening, everything in my head becoming a blur, the image of that eye, and then flashes, bright, furious, like lightning, cutting through the dark corners of my memory. And then it all became clear. This wasn't just a vision. This was something that held me captive, that was affecting my psyche, destroying it step by step. I began to feel how it was merging with me, how the border between me and this creature was erased. I couldn't breathe. My gaze was fixed, my eyes were closed, and there was an emptiness inside my head. I was losing touch with reality, not knowing what was real and what was imagined. At that moment, I felt something powerful taking over my soul. It was consuming my consciousness. My gaze flickered around the room again, and the walls seemed to move. My life was no longer mine. I was a part of it. That I, that emptiness, they had become a part of me. I felt the darkness begin to penetrate me. With each passing moment, it became more tangible, almost physical. I knew that I could not escape. I was consumed. But in that moment, when all seemed lost, I saw something. A moment, as brief as a flash of lightning, and I saw that look begin to lose its shape. It was still there, but it began to tremble, like a bubble ready to burst. It was like the final act of a struggle. I couldn't understand what was happening. I was blinded. But at that moment, my fight was not over. Story 8. I don't remember when I first noticed it. It was always there, like a blur in the distance, something I could see but couldn't quite place. I may have been 10, maybe a little older, but I know it was there, at the edge of my vision from the very beginning. It didn't move. It was like part of this world, but not quite part of it, and whatever it was, I knew I couldn't look at it. My mother often told me not to dwell on strange things. I was a child, and there were always many things that were hard to explain to me, but this was something else. I noticed it when my mother and I were walking in the park. We were walking along the sidewalk, and as always, I would reach out to the flowers, dreaming of catching one in the air, and she would scold me for my absent-mindedness. But every time I turned around, I would see it. It was far away, but in such an unnatural position that even the distance between us did not relieve him of the feeling that I had seen something wrong. It was an old man, hunched over, but so strangely twisted that I couldn't see him all the way through. His hair was long and greasy, hanging over his face, which was almost hidden in the dark folds of the cloth he wore. At first I thought he was just some old man who had chosen an odd place to camp, but it soon became clear to me that this man was more than just odd. He was sinister. His every movement, his every existence in that place was like a rupture in reality, like a stain on the cloth. I was afraid, but I couldn't look away. I just knew it was important. I knew it was something that would haunt me once I saw it. I tried not to think about it, but he was there every time I passed. Sometimes he was further away, sometimes closer, but he was always there. He was the same as that day in the park, an old man with withered hands and a face distorted with unbearable horror. He stood far away, not moving, and every time I turned to leave, I felt his gaze. It was something strong, as if he was looking right at me. I tried not to think about it. I tried to look at the world around me, to forget about him. Time passed, and he became part of my memories, part of my days, like some kind of constant shadow. I stopped knowing when exactly he appeared. He was always there, but the older I got, the more I noticed him. At first I convinced myself that it wasn't that important, that it was just some kind of nightmare that sometimes appeared in the corner of my vision. But he didn't go away. I learned to walk around it, to look past it. It was still there, in its place, as if it needed nothing more. It was just there. I began to feel its gaze, even when it was not in sight, like a shadow that stretched beyond the horizon but was always there. And the older I got, the more I realized that it was not just some figure in my imagination. It was something more. At the age of 12, I realized that this was no coincidence. He always stood in the same place. And it suddenly became clear to me he was always there. I began to see him almost everywhere, sometimes in mirrors, sometimes in stained glass windows when I passed a store. I felt him behind my back as soon as I turned my head, as soon as my attention was distracted from more important things. And the strangest thing was that no one but me saw him. He did not appear in conversations. When I tried to talk about him, my words were met with bewilderment. I was told that I was making it up, that these were some kind of teenage experiences. But I knew that was not so. I knew he was there. I felt him. As I became more aware as a teenager, I began to notice that there were moments when his presence was not just felt, but growing. At one point, I realized that every time I turned left, he seemed to get closer. It was so subtle that I barely noticed it. At first, it seemed like a coincidence. He was standing in the same place, as always. But every time I turned left, I felt his presence grow stronger. At first, it was subtle. A spot in the distance would become a little clearer, a little closer. Then, the older I got, the more I felt it. I began to avoid left turns. It was strange, but if I was following a familiar route and at some point I started to turn around to go in the direction where I knew he would be, I could feel his gaze focused on me. At such moments, I forced myself to go right, without thinking, even if the path became longer and more awkward. I didn't want to meet him. I didn't want him to get any closer. But time does not stand still. Sometimes, returning home late at night, I still felt it like something dark, shrinking in my consciousness. And the older I got, the more obvious it became that this shadow was more than just a figure on the horizon. I began to notice that the shadow had become not only a part of my perception, but also a part of my world. There were no more simple walks. Every movement, every step on the street or in the park, I felt it. It was somewhere nearby, like an invisible wall that grew stronger with each passing day. There was no place where I could feel safe from this presence, not even in my own home. At night, its shadow would wrap around the walls of my room, and sometimes I thought I could hear it breathing, even if it was not there. Every morning started the same way. I would wake up with a feeling that something was wrong. He was there, even if I couldn't say exactly where. In the mirror, on the window pane, or in a reflection I caught as I walked past. I even began to avoid looking out the window so as not to see his reflection. It became a whole ritual, not to look at the glass, not to turn around, not to think about him. But as always, he was there, constantly. I used to be careful when I went out, just one step forward, but I always felt my back tighten, as if I was trapped, afraid that as soon as I turned away, his face would be there again. He was always there, even if I couldn't see him. He was that spot in the shadows that never went away. But one morning was different. I was standing at the door, ready to go out, when a figure caught my attention. At first I didn't understand what it was, but then, as usual, I noticed it. Its silhouette was familiar, but with something new that I couldn't immediately place. It stood a few meters away from me, motionless, as if it were waiting on purpose. But it wasn't as I remembered it. Its shape was distorted, as if its entire being had been stretched, and its face was completely unfamiliar. Even if its eyes were the same, my heart sank as I watched him begin to move. Not suddenly, not quickly, but as if everything in his body was in slow motion. He took a step, then another. I stood there, unable to move. He was so close now that I could make out every detail. His lips parted slightly, and I heard a faint hiss that seemed to come from the ground itself. I stood there, unsure of what to do. He was closer than ever, but I felt like if I took a step back, it would get worse. I tried to turn my head, but my body refused to obey. It was all so strong, so intrusive. His presence filled the air, squeezing my lungs. I knew I couldn't just walk away. I needed to understand what this was. All those years of avoidance, all those sideways steps, right turns, fear, it had all led to this moment. I couldn't help but look into his eyes, and I did. I looked up, even though deep down I knew it would be a mistake. His eyes were not human. They were deep, black as an abyss, with an alien depth that I could not sink into. And when I looked into them, I felt the world around me disappear. It was not like the way a gaze usually works, the way you feel its impact. It was like an absorption, like a shrinking vacuum that pulled me out of everything I knew. I flinched back, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. I was trapped, as if he was a part of me. It was like being consumed, as if he was penetrating me, leaving no corner for escape. His mouth opened, and I heard a whisper. It wasn't something you could call words. It was a feeling of something ancient and timeless. And as I stood there, trying to escape this nightmare, I realized that I couldn't run away anymore. I took a sharp step back, but my legs wouldn't move. They seemed to be stuck to the ground. I tried to scream, but no sound came out of my throat. My fear became constricting, impossible. He was almost there. His shadow enveloped everything around. I was close to the edge, but I couldn't believe it was happening. I tried to run. I tried to turn around, but he didn't disappear. His shadow held me tight, as if I was part of this reality, part of this nightmare. My gaze met his again, and at that moment I realized that I didn't have to do anything anymore. He was already here. Every time I think that this is it, that there will be no more surprises, that I finally understand how everything works, he scares me with something new. That day when I saw him through the window, I thought that I would have enough for one more step to the side, but it was not so. Everything turned out to be worse than I could have imagined. I began to avoid looking at his silhouette. It was impossible not to notice him, but I tried. I closed the windows, put up the curtains, and even turned off all the mirrors in the house. It seemed that everything connected with him only strengthened his presence. Every corner was closed, every glance drove him away, but I knew he was waiting. Once inside my house, I could still feel him there. With every move, every turn, every step down the hallway, I felt him coming closer. His breathing, his raspy cough, his dark eyes. It was all so real that I began to wonder if I was part of this nightmare. Maybe he wasn't just a shadow on the street, but a part of me. But here's what really scared me. I began to realize that I had lost my sense of time. I didn't know how long I'd been in my house without leaving. This feeling was consuming me, and it was hard to figure out where reality ended and everything else began. I'd wake up not knowing how long I'd been asleep. I'd wake up in the middle of the night with a heavy, dull feeling that something was wrong, that he was getting closer. One morning, as I was looking at my reflection in the window again, I saw him. He was there, as always, but his shape was slightly different. His features were blurry now, as if his face had been smeared into nothingness. It was not the face I remembered, not his eyes, not his smile. He was like a lost shadow that could not return to its shape. I felt a chill fill the air, as if the entire room had frozen. The fear was so great that I couldn't even move. Everything inside me screamed at me to get away, to not be here, to not be looking at this. But I looked anyway, because I knew that if I looked away for even a second, he would be behind me. He would be right there. At that moment, I knew I was on the edge of him coming out of his shadow and into my world, on the edge of me becoming a part of him. I remembered my life before him, before this constant terror. I remembered how I once lived without this feeling, how I didn't know that there was something that could follow you, your every step, your every move. But now, that was all I knew. I took a few steps back, not taking my eyes off the window. My heart was beating fast, as if it was trying to escape from my chest. But the more I looked, the less I could separate myself from it. It was more than fear. It was like a magnet pulling me in, as if I was tied to it by an invisible thread. I started moving toward the door. My goal was simple: get out, escape, forget. But as soon as I took another step, I realized it wouldn't help. He was behind the door. He was always behind the door. And now, as I put my hand on the handle, I felt his presence surrounding me again, filling the air. My hands began to shake and my breathing became ragged. I froze. Every cell in my body screamed at me to leave, to not be here, to crawl underground and hide. But I couldn't, because no matter how hard I tried, I knew this wasn't the end. I couldn't escape what was about to happen. I turned around, but before I could take 2 steps, I heard his footsteps behind me. It wasn't just a sound, it was a feeling, as if his feet were touching my skin. It was like a shadow that blends with you, like a breath you can't ignore. I turned around, and there he was. He was standing a few meters away from me, his eyes dark and empty, his face stretched into an unnatural grin. I screamed, but my scream was muffled, as if it had no meaning. I tried to back away, but every step back was like walking into a wall. He stood there, looking at me, his eyes filled with hunger. He didn't move, but I knew he was already there, in my life, and that maybe I was the only one who could see him. In that moment I knew. No matter how much I avoided him, he would always be there. And now that I was face to face with him, I realized the terrible truth. I couldn't get out anymore. Every night I slept worse and worse. Every morning I woke up with the feeling that the world had narrowed a little again, and the space around me had become tighter. My hands, when I tried to move, felt alien, as if they did not belong to me, as if I had lost touch with my own body. I tried to fight it, but what can you do when the world itself is against you? That old man, the one who always stood there in the corner of my vision, became more real with each passing day. I might not see him, but I knew he was there. His smell, like a mixture of rot and stale water, filled the air, leaving behind a murky, sticky shadow that I couldn't shake off. Even when I tried to shake him from my thoughts, his image would return, like a nightmare that wouldn't go away. I tried to believe that it was just paranoia, that I just needed to calm down. I went to doctors, tried to convince myself that all these feelings were nothing more than stress. But every time I closed my eyes, I felt him. I felt his gaze penetrating me, and I knew that his gaze was not leaving. It was staying. It was following me. My body no longer seemed to belong to me. I had lost control. He was everywhere, not just in the shadows, but inside me. With every step he took, his presence became more tangible. It was as if he was a part of my inner world, consuming me with every movement. And though I tried to ignore him, even tried to close myself off from him, his shadow continued to grow, enveloping every corner of my existence. I no longer knew how much time had passed since I had first noticed him. Weeks, months. I couldn't answer that question. I felt increasingly trapped in a time that didn't exist for me, a time I couldn't escape. One night, when I woke up in a cold sweat, I realized that I was no longer afraid of the old man himself. I had grown accustomed to his presence. He was a part of my life, like a guest who could not be driven out. My thoughts about him became ordinary, like thinking about some everyday thing. But then I realized that this was the greatest threat. Every day I lost the ability to feel alive, more and more. My body was no longer mine. It was as if he had penetrated me, become a part of me. I couldn't even understand when exactly this had happened. My body was like an empty shell, and inside me there was nothing but his shadow. I was afraid that one day he would completely consume me, and I would be unable to do anything to stop it. Then one day, when I woke up again, I realized that everything had changed. He wasn't just there, he was a part of me. I felt his skin stick to mine, his breath, cold and foul, filling my lungs. He was inside me, so close that I could no longer imagine where I ended and where he began. I was with him, and he was in me. At that moment I realized I couldn't run away. All those attempts to ignore him, all those pathetic efforts to be normal, were in vain. He was a part of me. His breath merged with mine, his movements became my movements, and when I stood up to look in the mirror, I realized I no longer saw who I used to be. I could no longer differentiate between him and myself. We had become one being. I was sure that I could no longer live without him. And then I felt his dark energy envelop me completely, filling every cell of my body. I didn't have to do anything. He was inside me. He had already become me. I cringed when I realized that I could never go back. He had become a part of my life, and I would never be free again. Days and nights intertwined into one endless, unbearable stream. My thoughts became blurred, like the fog that covers the earth in the morning. I could no longer tell exactly when day came and when night came. My nights resembled a strange cycle in which I tried to fight something I could not explain, and my days became empty, like my existence. I didn't feel human anymore. I was a machine that moved only because it was programmed to. He was with me, and I was with him. Every step I took, every movement I made, I felt his presence. When I tried to sleep, he was there, crushing me with his weight, making me feel his cold flesh penetrate my skin. When I tried to look in the mirror, I didn't see myself. I saw him. I didn't know where he began or where I ended. Sometimes I thought it was just my mind going crazy. But there was no room for doubt anymore. He was real. He was here. And he knew I couldn't run away. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the fact that he was a part of me. He was so deeply embedded in me that I didn't know where I ended and where he ended. It wasn't just a physical presence. It was something bigger, something that penetrated the very core of my being. I couldn't turn left because I knew he would follow me. I couldn't stop because I knew if I did, he would consume me completely. He was everywhere. Even when I closed my eyes, I could feel him. When I tried to do normal things, I could feel him. When I tried to push the thought of him away, it would always come back. I was consumed by him. It wasn't just a left turn anymore. It was so much more. It was all I knew. Every morning was an ordeal. I woke up feeling like my insides were twisted, like every breath I took was a fight to survive. His dark energy seeped into my bones, my muscles, my blood. He was inside me, and I didn't know how to get rid of it. But even as I tried to fight it, his presence only grew stronger. That night I lay in my bed, feeling him curled around me. His palm was pressed to my stomach. His body, cold and clammy, was next to me. I couldn't believe this was happening to me. I couldn't understand how I had gotten myself into this situation. But I knew one thing. I couldn't leave. He was with me forever. I tried everything to relax a little, to forget for a second, but with each passing day his presence became stronger. I could no longer imagine a world without him. He became my only companion, my only reality. And when I tried to turn left again one day, I realized that I couldn't do it anymore. He was so close to me that I didn't know if I could even take another step. My body was so overwhelmed by his presence that I didn't feel alive. At that moment, I realized that this was the end. This was the end not only for me, but for him too. We had become one. I was not prepared for what happened, but I could not stop this process. I was with him, and he was with me. And now, when I stand on the edge of this madness, when there is no more time for reflection and doubt, I cannot imagine life without this creature that squeezes me, consumes me. We have become one. I no longer know who I am or what is happening, but I know one thing. I will never be able to get out of this. And perhaps I no longer need to.